A 17-year-old girl sits alone in a rain-soaked diner at 2 in the morning, hiding bruises she's carried for years. And the one man dangerous enough to notice is an outlaw biker who swore he'd never save anyone again. But tonight, the storm outside Black Hollow, Montana isn't the only thing closing in. Because somewhere on that frozen highway, a monster is already driving toward her. And by dawn, 15 motorcycles will line up outside this diner like a wall between her and everything she's ever feared. This is a story about broken people, chosen family, and the kind of redemption that rides on two wheels through the coldest night of your life. If this story hits you the way I think it will, stay until the very end, because the last 5 minutes will wreck you. Drop a like right now, leave a comment telling me what city you're watching from, and let's ride. Part 1. The rain didn't fall in Black Hollow, Montana. It attacked. It came sideways off the Bitterroot Range like something personal. Like the sky had a grudge against every living thing stupid enough to still be breathing in this forgotten stretch of highway between nowhere and nothing. The kind of rain that turned asphalt into black mirrors and made headlights look like the eyes of animals you couldn't name. The kind of rain that made you feel like the whole world had been wiped clean of people, and all that was left was you, your mistakes, and the sound of water hitting glass. It was 1:47 in the morning, a Tuesday, or maybe a Wednesday. The kind of hour where days blurred into each other and time only mattered to people who still had somewhere to be. Rosie's diner sat on the edge of Route 93 like a wound that refused to heal. The building was old, not charming old, not rustic old, just old. The neon sign above the door buzzed and flickered, throwing sick pink light across the wet parking lot in stuttering bursts. Half the letters had burned out years ago, so now it just read ROIEs. Like even the building had given up on being whole. The windows were fogged. The linoleum inside was cracked and yellowed. The ceiling fan above the counter turned so slowly it seemed like it was thinking about stopping. Everything in the place smelled like burnt coffee, old grease, and the kind of loneliness that soaks into walls and never leaves. There were 4 people inside. A cook no one had ever seen smile. A waitress named Donna, who was 53, divorced twice, and moved through the diner like a woman who had stopped expecting anything good from any room she walked into. A man at the counter, and a girl in the corner booth. The girl was the reason this story exists. Ellie Mercer was 17 years old, 5'4", and weighed maybe 110 pounds soaking wet. Which, tonight, she was. Her dark hair clung to her face in wet strings. Her hoodie was 2 sizes too big, gray, with a tear along the left shoulder she'd tried to fix with a safety pin that had already come undone. Her jeans were muddy at the knees. Her sneakers were the cheap kind you get at the discount rack, the ones that fall apart after 3 months, and hers were well past that deadline. She sat with her back pressed into the corner of the booth like she was trying to disappear into the vinyl, knees pulled up, hands wrapped around a glass of Coke she hadn't touched. The ice had melted 20 minutes ago. She hadn't noticed. Every time headlights swept across the parking lot, her whole body flinched. Not a big flinch. Not the kind most people would catch. Just a tightening. Shoulders pulling inward, fingers pressing harder against the glass. Breath going shallow for half a second before she forced it back to normal. It was the flinch of someone who had learned a long time ago that light usually came right before something bad. She wasn't waiting for anyone. She was hiding from someone. And there's a difference between those two things that most people are lucky enough to never learn. Donna had tried talking to her once, about an hour ago, walked over with a coffee pot she wasn't offering and said, "You okay, sweetheart?" The girl had looked up with eyes that were dry but somehow still looked like they'd been crying for years and said, "I'm fine." And Donna, who had heard that exact lie and that exact tone from her own mouth more times than she could count, had nodded slowly and walked away. Because sometimes "I'm fine" isn't an answer. It's a door being closed in your face by someone who's drowning on the other side. 2 stools down from the center of the counter, a man sat drinking black coffee like it was the only thing keeping his hands from doing something else. His name was Ryder Kane, and he looked exactly like the kind of man your mother warned you about and your father pretended didn't exist. He was 38, 6'2", built like someone who had spent years carrying things heavier than weight, guilt, memory, the kind of grief that settles into your skeleton and becomes part of how you move. His face was angular, hard-lined, weathered by wind and road and time in a way that made him look older than he was from some angles and dangerously sharp from others. A scar ran from just below his left ear down to the corner of his jaw. Not a clean scar, not a surgical scar, the kind that comes from something that was trying to kill you and almost succeeded. His knuckles were scarred too, thick and white across the ridges. The kind of hands that had hit things and been hit by things and had long ago stopped keeping track of which was which. He wore a black leather jacket, not the fashionable kind, the real kind. The kind that smelled like rain and exhaust and years of highway. The back of it carried a patch, a faded gray skull with wings stitched above the words Iron Saints MC, and below them, Montana. His jeans were dark, his boots were heavy, and his eyes were the color of creek water in January. Gray, cold, and deep enough to hide things in. Ryder Kane was an ex-Marine. 2 tours in a desert he still couldn't talk about. He'd come home to a country that handed him a folded flag, a prescription for pills that made his dreams louder, and a thank you for your service that tasted like ashes every time someone said it. He'd tried the normal route. The job, the apartment, the girlfriend who left when she realized that the man who came home was not the same man who had shipped out. He'd tried therapy once, sat in a clean white room across from a man with soft hands and a degree on the wall and said 14 words in 50 minutes. The therapist said he had avoidant tendencies. Ryder said the therapist had never watched his best friend die on a dirt road 6,000 miles from anywhere that mattered. He never went back. The Iron Saints found him. Or maybe he found them. It didn't matter. What mattered was that for the first time since he'd come home, he was around men who understood that silence wasn't emptiness. It was survival. Men who had their own scars, their own nightmares, their own reasons for riding highways at 3 a.m. instead of lying in beds that felt too safe to trust. The club wasn't a gang. It wasn't a fraternity. It was a collection of men who had been broken by various machines, war, poverty, abuse, systems that chewed people up and spit them out with nothing but trauma and a social security number, and had decided to be broken together rather than alone. That was the whole philosophy. You ride. You show up. You protect what's yours, and when one of you is drowning, the rest don't call for help. They jump in. Ryder hadn't spoken to anyone in the diner. He'd been sitting there for 40 minutes, gloves still on, coffee going cold, watching the rain without seeing it. He was thinking about his sister. He was always thinking about his sister. Her name had been Lily. She'd been 15 the last time he saw her alive. He didn't talk about Lily, not to the club, not to anyone. But she lived in every silence he carried, every flinch he noticed in other people, every bruise-shaped shadow he couldn't stop scanning for. She was the reason he sat with his back to the wall in every room. She was the reason he never slept past 4 a.m. She was the reason his hands tightened around the coffee mug now, as something in his peripheral vision snagged like a fishhook in his chest. The girl in the corner booth had reached for her Coke. Her sleeve slid back, just an inch, just for a second. But a second was enough. The bruises around her wrist were dark, not fresh dark, but layered dark. The kind that come from being grabbed in the same place over and over so many times that the skin forgets what its natural color is supposed to be. Purple underneath, yellow-green around the edges, and beneath all of it a faint ring of older marks that had healed but left shadows. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't a fall. This was a pattern, a signature. Someone's hand had been wrapping around that wrist like a vice, regularly, deliberately, for a long time. Ryder's coffee mug stopped halfway to his mouth. The diner sounds, the hiss of the griddle, the rattle of the ceiling fan, the tinny country song leaking from the ancient jukebox in the corner, all of it faded to static. His vision tunneled. For a moment, he wasn't in the diner anymore. He was standing in a hallway in a house in Butte, Montana, 14 years ago, watching a man he was supposed to call his stepfather drag his 15-year-old sister by the wrist into a bedroom while their mother sat on the couch pretending the television was louder than the screaming. He blinked. The diner came back. The rain came back. The girl was tugging her sleeve down, quick, practiced, automatic, a movement she'd done 1,000 times before, a movement that had become muscle memory, the body's version of a lie it tells so often it forgets its line. She didn't look up. She didn't know he'd seen. But he had. And something in Ryder Kane's chest that had been locked in a cage for 14 years shifted, pressed against the bars, and opened its eyes. He didn't move right away. That was the thing about Ryder. He never reacted fast on the surface. Everything happened underneath first. His jaw set, his breathing slowed. His eyes tracked the girl's movements with the quiet, methodical focus of a man who had spent years reading danger in landscapes. He watched how she held her body, the way her shoulders curved inward like armor, the way her eyes swept the door every 30 seconds, the way she made herself physically smaller in the booth as if she could shrink below the threshold of someone's attention. He watched, and he recognized. Not suspected. Recognized. Because the body keeps a record that the mouth won't speak, and Ryder Kane had learned to read that record a long time ago, in a language he wished he'd never had to learn. He set the mug down, quietly, pulled a $5 bill from his jacket and left it on the counter beside the coffee, stood up slowly, not because he was hesitant, but because sudden movements in a room with a frightened person are their own kind of violence, and he knew that too. He walked to the booth, not directly. He took the long way, past the jukebox, past the window, approaching from an angle where she could see him coming the entire time. When he reached the edge of her table, he stopped and stood there, hands visible, shoulders loose, making himself as unthreatening as a 6'2" man in a leather jacket covered in motorcycle club patches could possibly make himself. "You don't have to talk," he said. His voice was low, rough, like gravel stirred at the bottom of a riverbed. "But I need to ask you one thing, and I need you to answer it honest." Ellie's eyes shot up, wide, cornered animal wide. Her hand moved instinctively to cover her wrist. "Are you safe tonight?" 3 words. That was all. He didn't say what happened. He didn't say who did this. He didn't say, "Let me help." He asked the only question that mattered to someone in that booth at that hour. "Are you safe tonight? Not tomorrow, not in general. Tonight." Ellie stared at him. She stared at the scar on his jaw. She stared at the patches on his jacket. She stared at his hands, which were big and rough and scarred and absolutely still. And something happened in her face. A crack, a fracture, the kind that doesn't show in the skin, but shows in the eyes when a wall that's been holding for years develops its first fault line. Her chin trembled. She pressed her lips together hard enough to turn them white, and then she shook her head. Just once. Just barely. But it was enough. No. She was not safe tonight. Ryder pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. He didn't reach for her. He didn't lean in. He sat with his hands flat on the table, palms down, where she could see them, and he let the silence hold the space between them like something fragile they were both being careful not to break. Outside, the rain picked up. Somewhere on Route 93, an 18-wheeler blasted its horn into the void. Inside Rosie's diner, Donna refilled a coffee pot no one had asked for and watched the biker and the girl from behind the counter with an expression that lived somewhere between worry and hope. "My name's Ryder," he said after a while. "I'm not going to ask you anything you don't want to answer, but I'm going to sit here until you tell me what you need. And if what you need is for me to leave, I'll leave. No questions." Ellie swallowed. Her eyes were glassy but dry, the eyes of someone who had cried so many times that the tears had become unreliable, showing up for small things and disappearing entirely for the big ones. "He'll come looking for me," she said. Her voice was small. Not weak, small. The voice of someone who had learned to take up as little space as possible, including auditory space. "Who?" "My stepfather." Ryder's expression didn't change, but beneath the table, his right hand closed into a fist so tight that the scar tissue across his knuckles stretched white. He held it for 3 seconds, then he opened it, slowly, like he was making a choice. "Does he know where you are?" "He knows I come here sometimes, when it gets—" She stopped, looked at the table. "When it gets bad." "Is tonight bad?" She almost laughed. It came out as a sound that was closer to a gasp, the kind of sound you make when someone asks you if the ocean is wet. "Tonight is the worst it's ever been." She didn't elaborate. She didn't need to. The bruises on her wrist were a sentence. The way she flinched at headlights was a paragraph. And the fact that she was sitting in a diner at 2 in the morning in the rain, alone, 17 years old, with nowhere else to go. That was the whole story. Ryder looked at her for a long moment, and in that moment something passed between them that neither of them could have named. Not trust, not yet, but something before trust. Something like recognition. The way two people who have been through the same fire can look at each other and know, without words, that they are standing on the same scorched ground. "Okay," he said, and the way he said it, low, steady, final, made it sound less like a word and more like a door locking behind them both. He pulled his phone from his jacket pocket. It was old, cracked across the screen, held together by a case that had seen better decades. He scrolled to a name, pressed call, held it to his ear while the rain hammered the window beside them. It rang 3 times. "Ghost," Ryder said, just the name. Then, "I need you at Rosie's. Bring who you trust, and bring it quiet." He hung up, put the phone away, looked at Ellie. "Some people are going to come here," he said. "They're going to look rough. They're going to sound rough. But they're the safest people you'll meet tonight. I need you to believe that." Ellie searched his face. Whatever she found there, or didn't find there, because sometimes the absence of a lie is more convincing than the presence of a promise, made her nod. 26 minutes later, the first headlight cut through the parking lot, then another, then another. Then the sound, low, guttural, unmistakable. Not car engines, not truck engines. Harleys. The kind of sound that doesn't just fill a space but claims it, vibrating through the floor and the walls and the fillings in your teeth. The kind of sound that tells you something is arriving that doesn't care whether you're ready for it or not. They came out of the rain like ghosts made of chrome and leather. One by one, motorcycles swung into the parking lot of Rosie's Diner, kickstands dropping onto wet asphalt, engines dying in sequence like a heartbeat slowing down. 7, 9, 12, 15. 15 motorcycles parked in a row beneath the broken neon sign, rainwater streaming off leather seats and chrome exhaust pipes. Headlights going dark one at a time until the parking lot was nothing but the tick-tick-tick of cooling engines and the smell of exhaust mixing with rain. Ellie watched from the window. Her eyes were enormous. They came inside without urgency. No shouting, no dramatic entrance, just the sound of heavy boots on wet tile, one after another, steady as a metronome. The diner filled with the creak of leather, the drip of rain off jackets, the smell of tobacco and motor oil and cold highway air. They were big men, most of them. Not all. Some were lean, wiry, built like fencing wire, but they all carried themselves the same way, with the quiet, deliberate weight of men who had been through things that civilian language didn't have words for. Ghost was the first through the door. He was the club's VP, vice president, a man in his late 40s with a shaved head, a gray beard trimmed close, and eyes that looked like they'd been designed by someone who wanted to make a color that meant don't. He wore a denim vest over his leather jacket, patches covering every inch, and he moved with the unhurried calm of a man who had decided a long time ago that nothing in the world was worth running toward or away from. He spotted Ryder, nodded once, scanned the room. His eyes landed on Ellie and stayed there for exactly 2 seconds, long enough to see, short enough not to threaten. Behind him came Deacon, tall, black, early 50s, built like a man who had spent 20 years working with his hands and another 10 making sure those hands stayed controlled. He was the club's sergeant-at-arms, which meant he was responsible for discipline, security, and the general guarantee that when the Iron Saint said something was handled, it was handled. Deacon didn't say much. He didn't need to. His presence was a sentence that didn't require punctuation. Then Saint, the club's medic, real name Marcus Webb, former Navy corpsman who had spent 2 years patching together Marines in places the news didn't talk about, and had come home with steady hands and a prescription for nightmares. He was the gentlest man in the club, soft-spoken, patient, the kind of man who could set a broken bone while telling you about his daughter's school play and make you believe for a moment that the world was a place where both things could exist at the same time. Then the others: Hatchet, Coyote, Drifter, Boone. Names that weren't born but earned, each one a small story of survival or stubbornness or both. They filed in and filled the booths, the counter stools, the standing space near the door, and within 5 minutes, Rosie's Diner, a place that usually held loneliness and burnt coffee and not much else, felt like a fortress. Donna stood behind the counter, coffee pot in hand, watching 15 outlaw bikers settle into her diner at 2:30 in the morning, and for reasons she would never fully understand, she felt safer than she had in years. Ryder stood, walked to where Ghost leaned against the counter. "The girl," Ryder said, low enough that only Ghost could hear. "I see her." "Stepfather, the bruises are layered. This has been going on a long time." Ghost's jaw worked. He looked at the coffee in front of him, then at Ryder. "You sure about this?" "I'm sure." "This isn't a bar fight, Ryder. This is a kid. There are systems for this, social workers, cops." Ryder's eyes went flat. Not angry. Empty. The way a room looks after someone has taken everything out of it. "I called the county sheriff's office about a kid 3 years ago. You know what happened." Ghost was quiet. "Nothing happened," Ryder said. "That's what happened. Nothing. A report got filed, a social worker made a visit that was announced 2 days in advance. The house was clean when she got there. The kid had long sleeves on. The case was closed in 6 weeks. And 4 months later, that kid was in the hospital with a broken collarbone and a fractured orbital bone, and the stepfather was out on bail by Thursday." He wasn't talking about Ellie. They both knew that. He was talking about a case from 3 years ago that had ended badly. A kid named Tommy Voss, 13 years old, who had finally been removed from the home, but only after the damage was so severe that removal was just a word for too late. And underneath that, buried deeper than either man would say aloud, he was talking about Lily. He was always talking about Lily. Ghost nodded slowly. Not agreement, acknowledgement. The nod of a man who understood that the system works like a net. It catches some things, and the rest falls through, and the things that fall through are people. "What do you need?" "I need her somewhere safe tonight, somewhere he can't find her, and I need to know who this man is before the sun comes up." Ghost turned to the room. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. "Deacon, Saint, Coyote, on me." The 3 men materialized beside him like they'd been waiting for exactly those words. Ghost spoke in short, quiet sentences. Deacon's face hardened. Saint's face softened. Coyote, a wiry man in his 30s with quick eyes and a nervous energy that disguised a mind like a steel trap, pulled out his phone and started typing. Within 10 minutes, they had a plan. Saint would take Ellie to a motel called the Pine Ridge, 20 miles outside of town, a place the club had used before as a safe house for women and children leaving bad situations. It wasn't fancy, it was clean, it was quiet, and the owner, a retired Marine named Dale Hobson, who owed the Iron Saints more favors than he could count, asked no questions and kept no records. Deacon would ride escort. Coyote would run background on Wade Mercer. Employment, criminal history, known associates, property records, everything that existed in the digital world about a man who hid a child behind closed doors and smiled at neighbors over the fence. And Ryder would stay. Because Ryder always stayed. That was his particular curse. The inability to walk away from a burning building, even when he'd been burned before, even when the fire was the kind that left marks on the inside where no one could see them. He walked back to Ellie's booth, sat down across from her again. The diner had changed around them. It was full now, loud with the low murmur of men talking, the scrape of chairs, the clink of coffee cups. But the booth felt like a separate country, a small island in the middle of all that noise, where the only language spoken was the one between 2 people who understood damage. "These men," Ryder said, nodding toward the room. "They're my family, not by blood, by choice. And tonight, if you'll let them, they're going to make sure you're safe." Ellie's eyes moved across the room. She saw leather, scars, tattoos, faces that looked like they'd been assembled from spare parts by someone who valued function over beauty. She saw men who looked dangerous. And she saw something else, something underneath the surface. In the way Saint smiled at Donna when she refilled his coffee, in the way Deacon stood near the door with his arms crossed, not like a bouncer, but like a guard dog, in the way Ghost spoke to his men with his hand on their shoulders like a father. "Why?" she whispered. You don't even know me. Ryder looked at the table. For a long time he was quiet. When he spoke, his voice was rougher than before, like something inside him was scraping against something else. Because somebody should have done this for someone I loved, and nobody did. He didn't say who, he didn't say when, and Ellie didn't ask because she heard something in those words that was bigger and older and heavier than explanation, and she knew, the way you know things at 17 when the world has already taught you its worst lessons, that some doors stay closed for a reason. Saint approached the booth. He crouched beside Ellie, bringing himself to her eye level, and his voice was the calmest thing in the room. Hey, I'm Marcus. People here call me Saint, but Marcus is fine. I'm going to take you somewhere you can sleep tonight. Warm bed, locked door, no one knows where you are. That sound okay? Ellie looked at Ryder. Ryder nodded once. Okay, she whispered. They moved through the diner in a formation that looked casual but wasn't. Deacon went first, scanning the parking lot through the window before stepping outside. Saint walked beside Ellie, close enough to shield but not so close that she'd feel crowded. Ryder brought up the rear, hands in his pockets, eyes everywhere. Outside, the rain had softened to a steady drizzle. The neon sign buzzed overhead, casting broken pink light across the row of motorcycles. Ellie stopped at the edge of the sidewalk and stared at them. All that chrome, all that leather, all those machines lined up in the dark like sleeping animals. I've never been on a motorcycle, she said. Saint pulled a blanket from one of the saddlebags and draped it around her shoulders. You're riding in Deacon's truck tonight. Motorcycle lessons are for days when it's not trying to drown us. She almost smiled. Almost. It was the ghost of a smile, the memory of one, like her face remembered the shape but had forgotten the feeling. They loaded her into the truck. A black Chevy Silverado that smelled like gun oil and pine air freshener and old maps. Deacon got behind the wheel. Saint sat in the back beside Ellie. As the truck pulled out of the parking lot, Ellie pressed her forehead against the cold window and watched the diner shrink behind them, and with it, the row of motorcycles, and on the sidewalk in front of them, the silhouette of a man in a leather jacket standing alone in the rain, watching them go. Ryder didn't move until the truck's taillights disappeared around the bend. Then he stood there for another 5 minutes, rain soaking through his jacket, dripping off his jaw, pooling in the creases of his boots. He stood there because he needed the cold. He needed the discomfort. He needed something physical to anchor him to the present, so that his mind wouldn't drift back to that hallway in Butte, to that closed bedroom door, to the sound of his sister crying through the wall while he was 12 years old and too small, too scared, too powerless to stop it. He had been powerless then. He was not powerless now. When he finally walked back inside, Ghost was waiting at the counter with a fresh cup of coffee and a look on his face that said he already knew where this was headed. Coyote's got something, Ghost said. Ryder sat, didn't touch the coffee. Talk. Wade Mercer, 44, married Ellie's mother, Karen, 6 years ago. Karen Mercer died 3 years ago. Car accident. Single vehicle, wet road, BAC was 0, clean by all accounts. And by unclean accounts? Ghost slid his phone across the counter. On the screen was a photo. A man with a thick neck, small eyes, and the kind of smile that was designed to work at barbecues and parent-teacher conferences and fall apart completely behind closed doors. Wade Mercer looked like every monster that had ever hidden behind a lawnmower and a firm handshake. Unremarkable. That was the horror of it. Completely, perfectly unremarkable. No criminal record, Ghost continued. 1 DUI 8 years ago. Pled down. Works at the grain elevator on Route 12. Coaches Little League on Saturdays. Goes to the community center on Thursdays. Of course he does. 2 complaints filed with Child Protective Services in the last 18 months. Both closed. Insufficient evidence. Ryder stared at the photo. His expression was impossible to read. Flat. Controlled. The face of a man who had trained himself to keep the war inside. But his eyes moved with something that looked like calculation, and beneath that, something that looked like fury being held underwater by force of will. Where does he live? Farmhouse, edge of town, rural route, half-mile from the nearest neighbor. Isolated. Of course it is. Ghost leaned in. Ryder, what are we doing here? We're making sure that girl doesn't go back to that house. And if the system, The system had 18 months and 2 complaints and a dead mother, and it did nothing. How many more months does she get, Ghost? How many more bruises? How many more 2 a.m. runs to a diner in the rain before one night she doesn't make it to the diner? The silence between them was heavy enough to bend the counter. Ghost looked at his coffee, looked at Ryder, looked at the 15 men filling the diner behind them. Men who had all, in one way or another, been failed by systems that were supposed to protect them. Men who had found each other precisely because the safety nets of the normal world had holes big enough to fall through. Men who understood in their bones that sometimes the only thing standing between a person and the abyss is another person who refuses to look away. "Okay," Ghost said. And like Ryder before him, the words sounded less like agreement and more like the sound of something beginning that couldn't be stopped. Outside Rosie's diner, the rain kept falling on Black Hollow, Montana. The neon sign kept flickering. The highway kept stretching into darkness in both directions, empty and endless and indifferent to everything happening beneath its surface. And 20 miles away, in a motel room with the door locked and the blinds drawn, Ellie Mercer lay on a bed that wasn't hers, wrapped in a blanket that smelled like someone else's laundry detergent, staring at the ceiling while Saint sat in a chair by the door, reading a paperback with the patience of a man who had spent whole nights watching over people who couldn't watch over themselves. She didn't sleep. She didn't cry. She just lay there, listening to the rain on the roof, thinking about the man in the diner who had asked her a question no one had ever asked her before. "Are you safe tonight?" 3 words. And for the first time in 3 years, the answer wasn't a lie. But safety, she knew, was temporary. It was a motel room. It was a locked door. It was a stranger with kind eyes and a leather jacket. It wasn't a solution. It was a pause, a breath between waves. Because somewhere back in Black Hollow, in a farmhouse at the end of a rural road where the nearest neighbor was half a mile away, Wade Mercer was awake. He was sitting in the kitchen with the lights off, drinking whiskey from a glass he kept refilling, staring at the empty chair where Ellie usually sat. His phone was on the table. He had called her 6 times. She hadn't answered. The 7th time, he didn't call. He texted, 4 words. "You know what happens." And outside, the rain kept falling. And somewhere on a dark highway, engines were cooling. And in a diner that smelled like burnt coffee and old sorrow, an outlaw biker sat alone at the counter, staring at a photograph of a monster, planning something that would either save a girl's life or burn his own to the ground. The night was far from over, and what was coming with the dawn would be worse than anything the storm had brought. The coffee at Rosie's diner had gone from bad to poisonous somewhere around 4 in the morning. But Ryder Kane kept drinking it anyway because the bitterness gave his mouth something to do besides say the things building pressure behind his teeth. The diner had emptied to 5 men. Ghost at the counter beside him, Coyote in the corner booth with his laptop open and the blue light carving shadows into his face, Hatchet by the door with his arms crossed and his eyes on the parking lot, and Boone at the far end of the counter, asleep sitting up, chin on his chest, snoring softly into the collar of his jacket. The rest of the Iron Saints had gone home or to the clubhouse, a converted warehouse on the south end of town that smelled like engine grease and stale beer and the particular kind of brotherhood that doesn't need a roof to exist but appreciates one when it's raining. Coyote closed his laptop. The sound was soft, but it hit the room like a gunshot because everyone had been waiting for it. "Got something," Coyote said. He didn't stand. He just turned the laptop around on the table so the screen faced the counter. "And you're not gonna like it." Ryder walked over. Ghost followed. Hatchet stayed at the door but tilted his head like a dog hearing a frequency only he could catch. On the screen was a county records page, property filings, tax records, the kind of dry bureaucratic data that most people would never look at twice. Coyote pointed to a line halfway down. Wade Mercer doesn't just own the farmhouse. He owns the 12 acres around it. Bought it 6 years ago, right after he married Karen Mercer. Paid cash, $92,000. A grain elevator worker pays $92,000 in cash, Ghost said. It wasn't a question. It gets better. Coyote scrolled down. Karen Mercer had a life insurance policy. $200,000. Beneficiary was Ellie until Karen died. Then Wade petitioned to have himself named as guardian and changed the beneficiary to himself. Payout was processed 14 months ago. Ryder's hand was on the back of Coyote's chair. His knuckles were white. There's more, Coyote said, and his voice dropped half a register, the way it always did when he found something that made the bottom fall out. Karen Mercer's car accident. Single vehicle, wet road. I pulled the accident report from county records. Responding officer was a deputy named Dale Purcell. The investigation was closed in 11 days. 11 days. No toxicology beyond a basic BAC. No mechanical inspection of the vehicle. No witness canvass. Who signed off on it? Sheriff's office. Incident review was handled internally. Coyote paused, looked at Ryder with eyes that were careful and hard at the same time. Dale Purcell. I looked him up. He left the sheriff's department 8 months after Karen's accident. Know where he went? Tell me. Private security. Works for a company called Ridgeline Solutions out of Missoula. But here's the thing. I can't find Ridgeline Solutions anywhere. No website, no business filings, no Glassdoor reviews, just a P.O. box and a registered agent who also happens to be the attorney for... He pointed at the screen. Mercer Grain and Feed, which is the parent entity that holds the deed to Wade Mercer's farmhouse. The silence in the diner developed teeth. Ghost leaned back from the screen and rubbed his face with both hands, the way a man does when he can see the shape of something ugly forming but isn't ready to say its name out loud. You're telling me the man who investigated Karen Mercer's death now works for a shell company connected to Wade Mercer. I'm telling you what the records say. What it means is above my pay grade. Ryder straightened. His face had gone past anger into something colder, something that looked like stone polished by years of water running over it, smooth, hard, and completely without warmth. It means Ellie's mother didn't die in an accident, he said, and the man who made sure no one asked questions got paid for his silence. We don't know that, Ghost said. Firm. Not arguing. Anchoring. Ghost's job in the club had always been to stand at the edge of the cliff and hold the rope while other men leaned over it. What we know is there are connections. Connections aren't proof. And we're not cops. No, we're not. Ryder turned to face him. That's the point. Something shifted in the air between them. It was subtle, a tightening, a recalibration. The kind of shift that happens between two men who trust each other completely, but are about to disagree on something that matters. What are you saying, Ryder? I'm saying that girl has been beaten for years. Her mother is dead under circumstances that stink. The investigation was buried, and the man who buried it is on Wade Mercer's payroll. I'm saying the system already had its chance. 2 CPS complaints, a closed investigation, an 11-day accident review. The system looked at this and shrugged. And what do you want to do that the system won't? Ryder didn't answer right away. He walked to the window and stared out at the parking lot where the rain had finally stopped, but the asphalt was still black and wet and reflecting the neon sign in broken pink fragments. His reflection in the glass looked like a stranger, older, harder, a man shaped by all the things he hadn't been able to stop. I want to go to that farmhouse, he said, and I want Wade Mercer to understand that the world he's been living in, the one where he does whatever he wants behind closed doors and nobody comes, that world is over. Ghost stood up from his stool, slowly, the way men stand when they're about to say something that costs them. Ryder, I need you to hear me, not as your VP, as your friend. He walked to the window and stood beside him, both of them looking out at the same darkness. You're not seeing Ellie right now. You're seeing Lily. The name landed like a brick thrown through glass. Ryder's whole body changed, his shoulders locked, his jaw set so hard that the muscle in his cheek jumped twice. His breathing went shallow, quick, controlled, the breathing of a man pulling himself back from an edge. Don't, he said. One word, a wall. I have to, because if you go to that farmhouse running on what happened to your sister instead of what's happening to that girl, you're going to make decisions that can't be undone. And I'm not going to let you destroy yourself for a ghost, Ryder. I'm not. Ryder turned from the window, faced Ghost. And for a moment, the two men stood close enough that the distance between them wasn't measured in inches, but in years. Years of riding together, bleeding together, burying friends together, holding each other upright in parking lots at 3 in the morning when the nightmares got so bad that being alone felt like drowning. Lily was 15, Ryder said. His voice was barely audible. She was 15 and she came to me. She came to me and she told me what he was doing, and He stopped, swallowed. The muscles in his throat moved like he was choking on something that had been lodged there for 14 years. I was 18. I was about to ship out. Basic training in 2 weeks, and I told her to hold on. I told her I would come back and fix it. I told her to just hold on. Ghost didn't move, didn't speak. The diner was so quiet that the tick of the clock above the register sounded like a heartbeat. She held on for 4 months, Ryder's voice cracked. Not a big crack, a hairline fracture, the kind that runs through a foundation and brings down a building slowly, over years, from the inside. 4 months. And then she stopped holding on, and I was 6,000 miles away in a desert, and they sent a Red Cross message, and I sat in the dirt outside a tent and read that my sister was gone, and the man who did it to her was still breathing in a house I grew up in. He closed his eyes, opened them. The gray in them had gone darker, like water at the bottom of a well where light doesn't reach. So yeah, Ghost, I see Lily. I see her every time. And every bruise and every flinch and every girl sitting alone in a diner at 2 in the morning because her home is the most dangerous place she knows. And you can call that projection. You can call that unresolved trauma. You can call it whatever the therapists call it. But I call it the only reason I'm still alive. Because every time I see it, I get a chance to do what I didn't do 14 years ago. Ghost was quiet for a long time. Behind them, Coyote had closed his laptop and was staring at his hands. Hatchet had turned to face the wall. Even Boone had stopped snoring. Okay, Ghost said finally. But we do this smart. We do this the Iron Saints way. We go to that farmhouse, we stand on that porch, and we make it clear that the girl is under our protection. We do not touch him. We do not threaten him. We let the weight of 15 men standing in his yard do the talking. And if he escalates, if he makes a move, we respond, not before. And if he calls the cops, then he calls the cops. And we show them what Coyote found, the accident report, the shell company, the CPS complaints. We hand them a case that any competent investigator would have built 2 years ago if anyone had bothered to look. Ryder studied Ghost's face, looking for cracks, looking for hesitation. He found neither. Dawn, Ryder said. Dawn, Ghost confirmed. They didn't shake hands. They didn't need to. The agreement was made in the space between their eyes, in the shorthand of men who had long ago stopped needing words to make promises. Ryder turned to Coyote. Print everything. Every document, every filing, every connection between Purcell and Mercer. I want a paper trail thick enough to choke on. Coyote nodded and opened his laptop again. Hatchet. Call the rest of the club. Full ride at dawn. Formation. Colors. Hatchet pulled out his phone. And somebody wake Boone up before he drowns in his own snoring. Boone jolted upright, blinked, wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, and said, I was awake. Nobody believed him. Nobody cared. The next 3 hours passed the way hours pass before a battle. See, slowly, weighted, full of small actions that carry enormous significance. Men cleaned their bikes in the pre-dawn dark. Coyote's printer at the clubhouse churned out pages. Ryder sat on the back steps of the diner and smoked a cigarette he'd bummed from Hatchet, the first cigarette he'd had in 2 years, and watched the eastern sky turn from black to the color of an old bruise. At 5:30, his phone buzzed. A text from Saint. She's awake. She's asking for you. He stared at the message for a long time, then typed back, Tell her I'll see her today. Tell her it's going to be okay. He sent it. Then he sat there with the phone in his hand, hating himself for the lie. Because he didn't know if it was going to be okay. He didn't know anything except that a 17-year-old girl was hiding in a motel room, and a man with blood on his hands was sitting in a farmhouse 20 minutes away. And somewhere between those 2 points, the Iron Saints Motorcycle Club was about to insert themselves into a situation that could end in justice or disaster, or both. And the line between those things was so thin you could cut yourself on it. At 6:15, a call came in that nobody expected. Ryder's phone rang. Not Ghost, not Saint. The screen showed a number he didn't recognize. He answered. Mr. Kane? A woman's voice, professional, clipped. Who's this? My name is Patricia Langford. I'm a social worker with the Montana Department of Public Health and Human Services. I'm calling about Ellie Mercer. Ryder's blood went cold. Not from fear, from the mathematical precision of the timing. Ellie had been gone from Wade's house for less than 6 hours. The sun wasn't even up. And already, a social worker was calling. How did you get this number? Mr. Mercer filed a missing persons report at 4:12 this morning. He told the sheriff's office his stepdaughter left the house after a disagreement, and he's concerned for her safety. Your name came up in the report. My name? Mr. Mercer told deputies that his stepdaughter has been associating with members of a motorcycle club, and he believes she may have been taken against her will. He specifically named you. Ryder stood up from the steps. The cigarette fell from his fingers and hissed out on the wet ground. She wasn't taken. She left. I understand, but Mr. Mercer has filed a custodial interference complaint. He's Ellie's legal guardian, and she's a minor. If you know where she is, you're legally obligated to... To what? Send her back to the man who's been beating her for 3 years? Silence on the line. Then, Mr. Kane, I understand this is emotional, but I need to follow procedure. If you have evidence of abuse, I need you to bring it to our office so we can... Your office has had 2 complaints in 18 months. What happened to those? A longer silence, the kind that has paperwork and liability and career considerations buried inside it. I'm not at liberty to discuss previous cases. What I can tell you is that if Ellie is with you or with anyone associated with your organization, and you do not return her to her legal guardian or bring her to our office by end of business today, law enforcement will be involved. Law enforcement is already involved. They have been for 3 years. They just haven't done anything. Mr. Kane, you want Ellie? Come find her. Bring a camera. I want someone to document what her wrists look like. I want someone to ask her what happens in that house when the neighbors aren't looking. And then I want someone to explain to me how a man can hit a child for 3 years and the best the state of Montana can do is call the guy who pulled her out of the fire. He hung up. His hand was shaking. Not from anger, from the realization that the ground had just shifted beneath all of them. Wade Mercer wasn't going to sit in that farmhouse and wait for dawn. Wade Mercer was already playing offense. He had called the sheriff's office. He had filed a report. He had named Ryder by name. He had framed the narrative. Concerned father, dangerous bikers, vulnerable girl led astray. By the time the sun came up, the story in Black Hollow wouldn't be about a man who abused his stepdaughter. It would be about a motorcycle gang that kidnapped a minor. Ryder walked inside and told Ghost everything, word for word. Ghost's face didn't change during the telling, but his hands did. They went from resting on the counter to flat against it, fingers spread, pressing down like he was trying to hold the building in place. He's smart, Ghost said. Smarter than I wanted him to be. He's had practice. This is a man who buried an accident investigation and made 2 CPS complaints disappear. He knows how the machinery works. He's been inside it for years. Then we need to move faster than the machinery. That's what I've been saying. Ghost looked at him, hard. The kind of look that strips away everything except the essential question. And I'm telling you again, we do this smart. The second we put 15 bikes on that man's lawn, we become the story. The media, the sheriff, the social workers, they all look at us and see what Wade wants them to see. Dangerous outlaws. That's the playbook he's running. He files the report, he flips the script, and suddenly we're not the rescue. We're the threat. So what do you want to do? Wait? File a counter-complaint? Sit in a meeting room with a social worker who's already closed 2 cases on this man? I want to win. And winning doesn't look like a confrontation on his porch that he can photograph and hand to his lawyer. Winning looks like evidence so clean that no one can bury it. The girl is the evidence, Ghost. Her body is the evidence. Every bruise on her is a document that the state of Montana has been too lazy or too corrupt to read. Then we get it read. We take her to a hospital, an independent one, not the county clinic. We get a full medical exam, we get photographs, we get a doctor on record, and we get a lawyer, not some public defender, a real one. and we hand them Coyote's research and Ellie's medical report, and we build a wall so high that Wade Mercer can't climb over it, around it, or through it. Ryder's jaw worked. He wanted the farmhouse. Every cell in his body wanted the farmhouse. He wanted to stand on that porch and look that man in the eyes and make him feel what Ellie felt every night. The terror of being trapped with someone stronger who could do whatever they wanted. He wanted it so badly his teeth ached. But Ghost was right. And Ryder hated that Ghost was right, because being right was complicated and slow and bloodless. And the part of him that was still 18 years old and standing in that hallway in Butte wanted something simpler, something that involved his fists and a man on the ground and the sound of justice being delivered in the only language that men like Wade Mercer understood. One day, Ryder said, we do it your way for one day. Hospital, lawyer, paper trail. But if by sundown that girl is not safe, legally, permanently safe, we go to the farmhouse, and we do it my way. Ghost held his gaze for 5 full seconds. Deal. The dawn broke over Black Hollow like a wound opening, red and raw along the eastern ridge, bleeding color into a sky that had been gray for so long it had forgotten what warmth looked like. The parking lot of Rosie's Diner steamed as the morning sun hit the wet asphalt, and one by one, Harley engines turned over, coughing and rumbling to life in the cold air. 15 bikes, 15 men, 15 sets of hands that had done hard things and were prepared to do harder ones. But they weren't riding to the farmhouse. Not yet. Ryder threw a leg over his bike, a 2003 Heritage Softail, black as a bruise, with a scratch along the left saddlebag from a night in Bozeman he didn't talk about, and kicked the engine to life. The vibration climbed through his boots, into his legs, into his chest, settling into the hollow space behind his sternum where the anxiety lived. He gripped the handlebars and felt the leather of his gloves creak against chrome, and for a moment, just a moment, the noise inside his head went quiet. That was the secret of the motorcycle. Not speed, not freedom. Silence. The engine was so loud it drowned out everything else, and sometimes drowning out everything else was the closest thing to peace a man like Ryder Kane could get. They rode in formation, 2 columns, staggered, Ghost at the lead, Ryder at his right shoulder. The road unspooled beneath them like a black ribbon, lined with bare cottonwoods and fences that leaned at angles that suggested the wind in this part of Montana had opinions. The morning air was brutal, mid-20s, maybe colder, the kind of cold that doesn't just touch your skin, but enters it, finds your bones, and reminds you that warmth is a privilege, not a right. 20 minutes out, the Pine Ridge Motel appeared on the left, a single-story L-shaped building with peeling green paint and a vacancy sign that was always on because vacancy was the motel's permanent condition. Deacon's truck was parked outside room 7. Saint's bike was beside it. The curtains were drawn. Ryder parked, killed the engine, sat there for a moment with his hands still on the grips, breathing steam into the frozen air. Ghost pulled up beside him. Didn't cut his engine right away. Let it idle, the low rumble filling the silence between them. You okay? Ryder didn't look at him. No. Good. Means you're paying attention. He cut the engine. They walked to room 7. Ryder knocked. 2 knocks. A pause. 1 knock. The pattern they used. The lock clicked. Saint opened the door. The room was small, clean, anonymous. 2 beds, a television nobody had turned on, a bathroom with a fluorescent light that hummed. Deacon stood in the corner by the window, arms folded, watching the parking lot through a gap in the curtains. He hadn't slept. His eyes were bloodshot but focused, the eyes of a man running on discipline instead of rest. Ellie was sitting on the edge of the far bed. She was wearing the same clothes from last night, the gray hoodie, the muddy jeans, but someone, Saint probably, had given her a pair of clean socks and a glass of water that sat untouched on the nightstand. She looked up when Ryder walked in, and something happened in her face that was almost worse than tears. A flash of relief so raw and so desperate that it made the room feel smaller. You came back, she said, like she hadn't believed it. Like people leaving and not coming back was the most reliable thing in her world. I told you I would. He pulled the chair from the small desk and sat down across from her, maintaining the same distance he had in the diner, close enough to be present, far enough to not crowd. "How are you?" She shrugged, the universal language of teenagers who feel everything and trust nothing. "Ellie, I need to tell you something, and I need you to listen all the way through before you react. Can you do that?" Her eyes sharpened. Fear crept back into them like a tide. "Your stepfather filed a missing persons report last night. He told the police you were taken against your will." The color drained from her face. Not slowly, all at once, like someone had pulled a plug. No, no, I left. I walked out. I wasn't taken. I walked." "I know, we know, but he's flipped it. In the eyes of the law right now, you're a missing minor, and I'm the guy they're looking at." Ellie's breathing went fast, too fast. Saint took a step closer, his medic instincts firing, but Ryder held up a hand. "Look at me," Ryder said. Calm, low, the voice he used when things were falling apart and someone needed an anchor. "We are going to fix this, but I need your help. We're going to take you to a hospital, not here, somewhere safe, in Missoula, and we're going to get you checked out. Everything documented, every bruise, every mark, on record. And then we're going to talk to a lawyer, a real one. Someone who knows how to take everything you've been living through and turn it into something that can't be ignored. He'll find out. If I go to a hospital, he'll find out, and he already knows. The game changed the second he picked up the phone. There's no hiding anymore, not for you, not for him." Ellie stared at him. Her hands were shaking, gripping the edge of the mattress, knuckles as white as the sheets. "You don't understand," she whispered. He doesn't just hit me. He knows people. The sheriff, the school counselor. He plays poker with the judge's clerk every other Thursday. He coaches their kids. He mows their lawns. He's the nice guy on the block. And I'm the troubled girl who stays out late and doesn't do her homework and—" Her voice cracked. "Nobody's going to believe me over him. They never do." Ryder leaned forward. Not close. Just enough. "I believe you." 3 words. And they hit that motel room like a crack splitting open a frozen lake. Small on the surface, catastrophic underneath. Ellie's face crumbled. Not into tears, into something worse. Into the expression of someone who has been carrying a weight so heavy and so long that the first moment of someone else reaching for it doesn't feel like relief. It feels like collapse. She pressed her hands over her face and bent forward, and the sound she made wasn't crying. It was the sound of something structural giving way, a support beam that had been holding for years finally splintering under a weight it was never meant to bear. Saint moved to the bed, sat beside her, didn't touch her, just sat there, close, breathing steadily, being the calm in the room the way a wall is the stillness in a storm. Ryder stood, walked to the window, stood beside Deacon. "How long do we have?" Ryder asked quietly. Deacon's voice was low, bass deep, the kind of voice that comes from the chest instead of the throat. If he filed at 4 a.m. and the sheriff's office put it in the system by 6, they'll start active search by noon. Maybe sooner if Mercer pushes it. He'll push it. Then we need her in a hospital by 10 and with a lawyer by 2. Coyote? Already on it. He's got a contact in Missoula, a family attorney named Reynolds. Woman, former prosecutor. Handled domestic cases for 12 years before going private. She's good. How good? Good enough that the county attorney's office stopped taking cases against her clients because they kept losing. Ryder allowed himself one small nod. It was the closest thing to optimism he'd felt in 12 hours. "Get the bikes ready. We ride to Missoula in 30. He turned back to the room. Ellie was sitting upright again, wiping her face with the sleeve of her hoodie, trying to rebuild the composure that had crumbled minutes ago. She wasn't succeeding. She wasn't failing either. She was doing what survivors do, holding on with whatever she had, which wasn't enough, but had to be. "Ellie," Ryder said, "I need to ask you something, and I need the truth. Not because I'm judging you, because what you tell me next determines what we do and how we do it." She looked at him, waited. "Your mother's accident, 3 years ago, the car on the wet road." He paused, watched her face the way you watch a window during a storm, looking for the first sign of breakage. "Was it an accident?" The room stopped. Everyone in it stopped. Deacon's hand, which had been reaching for the curtain, froze. Saint's breathing went still. Even the fluorescent light in the bathroom seemed to hold its buzz. Ellie's expression didn't change. That was the tell. When a question should shatter someone and their face stays perfectly still, it means the shattering happened a long time ago, and what you're looking at now is the rubble pretending to be a building. I don't know, she said. Her voice was flat, detached. The voice of someone reciting a fact they've tried to make clinical so it won't kill them. But 2 weeks before she died, she told me we were leaving. She said she had a plan. She said she'd been saving money. She said we were going to her sister's house in Oregon. Did Wade know? She told him the night before. She told him she was done and she was taking me and she was filing for divorce. Ellie looked at the wall. Not at anything on the wall, just at the blankness of it. The next day she went to the store. She never came back. The silence in that room was the loudest thing Ryder Kane had ever heard. Did you tell anyone this? I told the social worker, the first time, the one who came after the first CPS complaint. What happened? She wrote it down. She said she'd look into it, and then the case was closed and I never heard from her again. Ryder looked at Ghost, who had come inside and was standing in the doorway, hearing everything. Ghost's face was carved from stone, but his eyes were furnaces. Coyote, Ghost said into his phone, which was already at his ear. Everything you found about Karen Mercer's accident. I need a copy for the attorney, and I need you to dig deeper. Medical records, insurance filings, phone records from the week before the accident. Everything. He lowered the phone, looked at Ryder. Neither man said a word. They didn't need to, because both of them now understood that this was no longer a story about a man who hit his stepdaughter. This was a story about a man who might have killed his wife when she tried to leave, who had buried the investigation through connections and money, and who had spent 3 years trapping a 17-year-old girl in a house with the ghost of her dead mother and the hands of the man who might have put her there. And somewhere in Black Hollow, that man was sitting in his kitchen, drinking coffee, waiting for the system to deliver his stepdaughter back to him, because the system had always delivered before. But what Wade Mercer didn't know, what he couldn't know, was that the system was no longer the only thing standing between him and the truth. 15 men in leather jackets were riding toward Missoula with a girl who was ready to talk and a file full of evidence that had been buried for 3 years. And when they got there, they weren't going to file a complaint. They weren't going to fill out a form. They weren't going to wait for a callback. They were going to hand a former prosecutor a case that smelled like murder. And the clock on Wade Mercer's careful little world was going to start ticking backward, toward the night 3 years ago when a woman told her husband she was leaving, drove to the store, and never came home. The only question left was whether they'd get there before Wade found them first. Because at that exact moment, in the farmhouse kitchen at the end of the rural road, Wade Mercer set down his coffee, picked up his phone, and dialed a number he hadn't used in 3 years. "Dale," he said, "we have a problem." And 20 miles away, 15 Harleys roared to life in the motel parking lot, and the sound rolled across the frozen Montana flatland like a warning from something ancient and unforgiving. A sound that said, "We're coming, and this time nobody's closing the case." The highway between Black Hollow and Missoula stretched for 112 miles of nothing. Frozen rangeland, barbed wire fences sagging under the weight of ice, and a sky so pale it looked like someone had washed all the color out of it and forgotten to put it back. The Iron Saints rode that highway in a column so tight and so disciplined that the cars pulling over to let them pass looked like they were witnessing something that belonged to a different century, a cavalry movement, a migration, something old and heavy and deliberate moving across the landscape with a purpose that civilians couldn't read but could feel in their chests when the engines rolled past. Ryder rode point beside Ghost, his face raw from the cold, his knuckles numb inside his gloves, his mind running calculations he didn't want to be running. The call from Patricia Langford sat in his chest like a splinter, not painful enough to stop him, but impossible to ignore. Wade Mercer had filed first. Wade Mercer had named him. Wade Mercer was building a cage out of legal language and concerned father theater, and every mile between Black Hollow and Missoula was a mile closer to the moment when the Iron Saints would have to prove they were something more than what their patches said they were. Behind him, in Deacon's truck, Ellie sat in the back seat with a blanket around her shoulders and Saint beside her, and she hadn't spoken since they left the motel. She was staring at her phone. Not at a screen. The phone was dead. She was staring at the blank glass like it was a window into something only she could see. The 6 missed calls from Wade. The text message. You know what happens. 4 words that contained an entire childhood of terror compressed into a sentence so small it could fit on a screen and so large it had shaped every breath she'd taken for 3 years. They reached Missoula at 9:47 a.m. The city sat in its valley like a bruise between mountains, the Clark Fork River running through its center gray and swollen with snowmelt. Ryder led the formation through downtown, past coffee shops where college students looked up from their laptops with wide eyes, past a courthouse whose stone steps would matter before the day was over, past a row of law offices on Front Street where the names on the doors were printed in the kind of font that charged $400 an hour. They parked outside St. Patrick Hospital. 15 Harleys lined up on the street like a barricade, engines ticking in the cold, chrome catching the flat winter light. People on the sidewalk stopped, stared. A woman pulled her child closer. A man in a business suit crossed to the other side of the street. The Iron Saints were used to this, the way the world looked at them and saw a threat before it saw anything else. It was the cost of the patch, the cost of being men who looked like the things society had decided to be afraid of. Ryder didn't care about the staring. He cared about the girl getting out of the truck on legs that were shaking, wrapped in a blanket that wasn't hers, walking toward a hospital entrance like she was walking toward a cliff. I'll go in with her, Saint said. Medical stuff is my lane. You and Ghost handle the lawyer. Ryder nodded. Then he crouched in front of Ellie, right there on the sidewalk, his knees on cold concrete, so he could look up at her instead of down. A deliberate choice. A man his size, with his scars, kneeling on a public street. It was a posture that cost him something, and they both knew it. They're going to ask you questions in there, he said. Hard ones. About the bruises, about how long, about who, and every answer you give makes you safer. Not right away, not today, but permanently. Do you understand? Ellie nodded. Her jaw was clenched so tight the muscles in her neck stood out like cables. I'll be right here when you come out. She looked at him, and then she did something she hadn't done before. She reached out and touched his arm, just her fingertips, just for a second, on the leather of his sleeve. It wasn't a grab, it wasn't a hold. It was the lightest possible contact a human being can make with another human being, and it carried more weight than anything Ryder had felt in 14 years. She went inside with Saint. Deacon followed, positioning himself in the hospital lobby like a piece of furniture that happened to weigh 240 pounds and had eyes that tracked every person who walked through the door. Ryder stood on the sidewalk and watched them go. Then he turned to Ghost. The lawyer. 2 blocks west, Reynolds and Associates. Coyote called ahead. She's expecting us. They walked. 2 men in leather jackets and motorcycle boots walking through downtown Missoula at 10 in the morning, drawing looks from everyone they passed. Ghost walked with his hands in his pockets, shoulders easy, the picture of controlled calm. Ryder walked like a man who was using every step to keep from running, either forward into action or backward into the past. The office of Margaret Reynolds, attorney at law, was on the 2nd floor of a brick building that had been a bank in the 1940s and still carried the architectural authority of a place that had once held other people's money. The waiting room was small, carpeted, unremarkable. A receptionist with reading glasses on a chain around her neck looked up when 2 bikers walked in and didn't flinch, which told Ryder everything he needed to know about the kind of clients Margaret Reynolds was used to dealing with. Mr. Kane and Mr. Holloway? Ghost's real name. Thomas Holloway. Nobody in the club used it. Hearing it in this clean, carpeted space felt like a foreign language. She's ready for you. 2nd door on the left. Margaret Reynolds was 51 years old, 5'6", and built like a woman who had spent 3 decades standing in front of judges and juries and opposing counsel and had decided long ago that physical intimidation was irrelevant when you had a brain like a surgical instrument. Her hair was gray, cut short, practical. Her eyes were brown and sharp and missed absolutely nothing. She wore a navy suit that was expensive without being showy and sat behind a desk that was organized with the precision of someone who understood that chaos in your workspace meant chaos in your arguments. She didn't stand when they entered. She gestured to two chairs across from her desk and waited until they sat. Coyote sent me a summary at 6 this morning, she said. No preamble, no pleasantries. I've been reading for 3 hours. I have questions. Ask. The girl, Ellie Mercer, she's 17. Wade Mercer is her legal guardian. You removed her from the home last night without authorization from any court or agency, correct? She removed herself. She was already at the diner when I found her. And then you arranged for her to be taken to a motel outside of town for her safety. I understand the reasoning. A judge may not. A 17-year-old minor was transported across jurisdictional lines by members of an unincorporated motorcycle club without parental consent or a court order. That's how it reads on paper. Paper doesn't show the bruises. No, that's what the hospital is for. She opened a folder on her desk, thick, printed, tabbed with colored flags. Coyote's work. The background research your man did is impressive, but impressive and admissible are two different things. The connection between Dale Purcell and Wade Mercer's shell company? That's interesting. It's not evidence. It's a thread. Threads need to be pulled by investigators with subpoena power, not by civilians with laptops. Then get an investigator. I intend to, but first I need standing. I need to be retained as Ellie's attorney. And Ellie is a minor, which means I either need her guardian's consent, which we obviously don't have, or I need a court to appoint me through a guardian ad litem proceeding. That takes time. How much time? If I file an emergency petition today, I can get a hearing by Friday, maybe Thursday if Judge Caldwell is feeling sympathetic. Thursday, that's 2 days. That's the system, Mr. Kane. The system is how she ended up with those bruises. Reynolds looked at him over the folder. Her expression didn't soften, but it changed. A recalibration. The look of a woman who was used to being the smartest person in the room, but who recognized that intelligence wasn't the only kind of knowing that mattered. I'm not your enemy, she said. I've handled 47 domestic abuse cases involving minors. I've won 39 of them. I've lost 8. Every one of those 8 keeps me awake at night. I don't take cases I don't intend to win, and I don't make promises I can't keep. So here's what I can tell you. If the medical exam shows what you say it will, and if the girl is willing to testify, and if your man's research holds up under scrutiny, this is winnable. But it takes days, not hours, and in those days I need Ellie to be somewhere safe, legal, and defensible. She's safe. She's in a motel room registered to a retired Marine who has off-the-books arrangements with a motorcycle club. That's not defensible. That's a liability. Ghost spoke for the first time. What do you need? I need a licensed foster placement or a verified family member willing to take temporary custody. I need it before the sheriff's office acts on Wade's missing persons report, and I need it today. She doesn't have family. Her mother's dead. Her father left before she was born. Her mother had a sister in Oregon, but... Oregon, Reynolds held up a hand. Name? We don't have it. Find it. If there's a living relative willing to take her, I can file for emergency kinship placement. That gives us legal standing and takes the custodial interference argument off the table. Ryder looked at Ghost. Ghost was already reaching for his phone. Coyote. Karen Mercer's sister. Lives in Oregon. I need a name, address, and phone number in the next 2 hours. Reynolds stood. Walked to the window. Looked down at the street where 15 motorcycles were parked in a line that made the sidewalk look like a military installation. There's something else, she said, her back still to them. Something in Coyote's file that concerns me. The accident. The accident. She turned around. If Karen Mercer's death wasn't accidental, if there's any chance that Wade Mercer was involved, this isn't a custody case anymore. It's a homicide investigation, and that changes everything. The jurisdiction, the agencies involved, the level of danger to the girl, and the level of danger to all of you. We know. Do you? Because right now you're sitting in my office thinking about how to protect a 17-year-old girl from her abusive stepfather. But if Wade Mercer killed his wife and got away with it for 3 years, then the man you're dealing with isn't just an abuser. He's a killer who has already demonstrated he can manipulate law enforcement, suppress investigations, and eliminate threats. And the threat he's looking at right now, the thing standing between him and the continued control of his stepdaughter, is you. The words settled in the room like smoke, heavy, toxic, impossible to wave away. I need you to understand something, Reynolds continued. I will fight this case with everything I have, but I need you alive and out of jail to do it, which means no farmhouse confrontations, no vigilante rides, no 15 bike shows of force on his property. You do that, and I lose the case, you lose your freedom, and Ellie loses the only people who have ever tried to help her. Are we clear? Ryder didn't answer right away. His jaw was working. His hands were gripping the armrests of the chair hard enough to leave impressions in the upholstery. Are we clear, Mr. Kane? Clear, he said. The word tasted like swallowing glass. They left the office and walked back toward the hospital. Halfway there, Ghost's phone rang. He answered, listened, stopped walking. Ryder watched Ghost's face change. It was subtle. Ghost was a man who had spent decades controlling his expressions the way a pilot controls an aircraft, with small, precise adjustments that kept everything level, even when the instruments were screaming. But something was happening behind those eyes. Something that looked like the floor dropping out of an elevator. When? Ghost said into the phone. Then, how? Then, where is he now? He hung up, looked at Ryder, and Ryder knew, before Ghost said a word, that whatever was coming next was going to shatter something. That was Hatchet. He's been monitoring the police scanner at the clubhouse. And 30 minutes ago, the Black Hollow Sheriff's Office issued a bolo for Ellie Mercer, missing an endangered minor. We expected that. We didn't expect this. Ghost's voice dropped, not for secrecy, for the weight of what he was about to say. The BOLO names you as a person of interest, not for custodial interference, for suspected kidnapping of a minor. The sidewalk tilted. Not literally, but something in Ryder's inner ear shifted, the way it does when the world rearranges itself around a new and terrible fact. Kidnapping. Wade Mercer went to the sheriff this morning with his attorney. Not a public defender, a private attorney from Great Falls named Victor Ashwood. Ring a bell? It didn't. Coyote ran the name 20 minutes ago. Victor Ashwood has represented clients in 3 separate cases involving allegations against members of motorcycle clubs. All 3 cases resulted in convictions, and all 3 cases were built on the same narrative: vulnerable minor, outlaw biker influence, coerced removal from the home. He's got a playbook. He's got more than a playbook. Ashwood is connected to a network of attorneys who specialize in anti-motorcycle club litigation. They've been building cases against clubs across Montana for years. They know the optics, they know the legal pressure points, and they know that the second a jury sees a leather jacket and a patch, the presumption of innocence goes out the window. Ryder stood on the sidewalk in downtown Missoula, the cold biting through his jacket, the weight of 15 Harleys lined up behind him, suddenly feeling less like protection and more like a target painted across his back. So Wade Mercer doesn't just hit his stepdaughter and maybe killed his wife, Ryder said slowly. He's got a hired gun attorney who knows exactly how to weaponize the legal system against a motorcycle club. Correct. And right now, in the eyes of the law, I'm not the man who helped a girl escape her abuser. I'm the outlaw biker who kidnapped a minor. Also correct. Ryder laughed. It wasn't a laugh. It was the sound a man makes when the absurdity of his situation becomes so extreme that the only response left is the noise your body makes when it can't decide between fury and despair. Where's the line, Ghost? Where's the line where protecting someone stops being the right thing and starts being the thing that destroys you? There isn't one. That's the whole problem. They stood there, 2 men on a sidewalk in the cold, surrounded by a world that had decided they were the villains before they'd even had a chance to tell the story. Ryder's phone buzzed, a text from Saint. Medical exam complete. Documented everything. You need to see this. They walked into the hospital. Deacon met them at the lobby entrance. His face was different. Not harder, because Deacon's face was already as hard as a man's face could get. But something underneath had shifted. Something in the way he held his shoulders, the way his hands hung at his sides, the way his eyes met Ryder's with an intensity that went beyond professional concern and into something that looked like barely contained violence. Saint's in the waiting room with Ellie, 3rd floor. The exam? The doctor wants to talk to you. They took the elevator in silence. The fluorescent light overhead was the kind of white that makes everyone look like they're already dead. When the doors opened, Saint was standing in the hallway. He was leaning against the wall with his arms crossed and his head tilted back, staring at the ceiling. His eyes were red. Saint didn't cry. In 2 tours as a Navy corpsman, in 12 years as the Iron Saints medic, in a lifetime of seeing damage that would break most people, Marcus Webb did not cry. He came close sometimes. He'd excuse himself. He'd sit alone in a room or on the back of his bike and breathe through it and come back with steady hands and a calm voice. But he didn't cry. He was crying now, not sobbing, not making noise, just standing in a hospital hallway with tears running down his face, his jaw locked, his hands clenched into fists at his sides, weeping in the silent, furious way of a man who has seen something that broke through every wall he'd spent years building. Ryder stopped walking. The sight of Saint crying did something to him that nothing else had. Not the bruises, not the BOLO, not the kidnapping charge, because Saint was the steady one. Saint was the anchor. If Saint was crying in a hospital hallway, then whatever was behind the door at the end of that hallway was worse than anything Ryder had prepared himself for. Saint. Marcus looked at him, wiped his face with the back of his hand, tried to speak, couldn't, tried again. It's not just her wrists, Ryder. His voice was barely there, a whisper wrapped in gravel. It's everywhere. Her back, her ribs, her... He stopped, closed his eyes, opened them. She has 2 healed fractures that were never set by a doctor. Her left 4th rib and her right ulna. Healed wrong. Months old at least. Maybe years. There are cigarette burns on her shoulder blade. 5 of them. In a line. Deliberate. Patterned. The hallway telescoped. The walls leaned in. The fluorescent light buzzed louder, filling Ryder's skull with a frequency that sounded like screaming from very far away. The doctor documented everything. 47 photographs. A full written assessment. She's calling it one of the most severe cases of chronic child abuse she's seen in 20 years of practice. Ghost put his hand on the wall. Not leaning, holding on. His fingers pressed into the plaster like he was trying to push through it. 47 photographs, Ghost repeated. 47. Ryder walked past Saint, down the hallway. His boots hit the linoleum with the mechanical rhythm of a man who had stopped being a person and become a function. A machine designed for a single purpose, moving toward a single point. He reached the door of the waiting room, stopped, put his hand on the frame. Inside, Ellie was sitting in a plastic chair by the window. She was wearing a hospital gown under a blanket. Her hair was pulled back. Without the oversized hoodie, without the layers she used as armor, she looked smaller. She looked like what she was. A child who had been hurt in ways that the English language had words for, but the human heart did not. She looked up at him, and in her eyes, Ryder saw something he recognized with a clarity that nearly dropped him to his knees. It wasn't fear, it wasn't sadness. It was the thing that comes after both of those. The blank, exhausted acceptance of someone who has shown the world their wounds and is waiting, with practiced hopelessness, for the world to look away. He didn't look away. He walked into the room and sat in the chair next to her. Not across from her. Next to her. And for a long time, they just sat there, 2 people side by side in a hospital waiting room, saying nothing, watching the pale winter light filter through the window and fall across the floor in patterns that didn't mean anything but were beautiful anyway. 47, Ellie said quietly. She wasn't asking. She knew. 47. Is it enough? It's enough to hang him. Not hang him. I don't want... She stopped, pressed her lips together. I just want it to stop. I just want to stop being scared all the time. I want to sleep in a bed without listening for footsteps. I want to eat dinner without watching his hands. I want to walk down a hallway in my own house without calculating how many steps to the back door. Her voice was steady. Too steady. The steadiness of someone who has rehearsed their own suffering so many times it has become a monologue. That's all I want. I don't want revenge. I don't want him to suffer. I just want him to stop. Ryder looked at his hands. They were clenched in his lap. He unclenched them, slowly, deliberately. Because what he wanted and what she wanted were two different things, and right now, her want mattered more than his. Then that's what we do. We make it stop. His phone buzzed. Coyote. He stepped into the hallway to answer. Tell me you found the sister. I found the sister. Name is Janet Harlow. Lives in Bend, Oregon. 41 years old, married, 2 kids, works as a school librarian, clean record, stable home. Did you talk to her? I did. A pause. The kind of pause that has something complicated trapped inside it. She didn't know. Didn't know what? Any of it. She didn't know about the abuse. She didn't know Karen tried to leave. And she... Another pause. Longer. She didn't believe that Karen's death was an accident. She said she told the sheriff's office that. She said she called 3 times. She said she was told the investigation was closed and there was nothing to pursue. She called 3 times. 3 times. And on the 3rd call, she says a deputy told her, and I'm quoting her here, "Ma'am, your sister drove off a wet road. People do that. I'm sorry for your loss." And that was the last she heard until I called her 30 minutes ago. Ryder leaned against the hallway wall. The plaster was cold against his back. The fluorescent light above him flickered once, twice, and steadied. Will she take Ellie? She's already packing. She said she'll drive through the night. She can be in Missoula by tomorrow morning. Tomorrow morning. Ryder closed his eyes. We need to keep Ellie safe until then. Legally safe, physically safe, everything. There's one more thing. Coyote's voice changed, dropped into the register that Ryder had learned to associate with the moment before bad news becomes catastrophic news. I kept digging on Purcell, the former deputy, the one who investigated Karen's accident. And? Purcell didn't just work for Mercer's shell company after he left the sheriff's department. He still has connections inside the department, active connections. I found phone records, calls between Purcell's personal cell and a current deputy named Ray Sutter. Dozens of calls over the last 2 years. And Ray Sutter is the deputy who responded to both CPS complaints against Wade Mercer. The floor dropped. The same deputy. The same deputy. Both complaints, both closures, same guy. And he's talking to the former deputy who buried Karen's accident investigation. Weekly, sometimes more. Ryder opened his eyes. The hallway looked different now. Not physically different, but the way you see a room changes when you realize there's someone in it who wants to hurt you. Ghost, he called. Not loud. He didn't need to be loud. Ghost appeared from the waiting room doorway in 3 seconds. We have a problem bigger than Wade Mercer. He told Ghost everything. The sister, Janet Harlow, already driving. The phone records between Purcell and Deputy Sutter. The same deputy closing both CPS complaints. Ghost listened the way Ghost always listened. Still, focused, absorbing information the way a sponge absorbs water, silently and completely. When Ryder finished, Ghost was quiet for 10 seconds. Then he said one word. Conspiracy. That's what the lawyer's going to call it. That's what it is. This isn't one man hitting a kid. This is a network. Mercer, Purcell, Sutter, maybe others. They're insulated, they're connected, and they've been protecting each other for years. Which means when we push, they don't just push back, they coordinate. Which means the bolo on you isn't just a scared stepfather's complaint. It's a system defending itself. The 2 men stood in a hospital hallway, surrounded by the antiseptic smell of a place designed to heal people, and confronted the reality that the thing they were fighting was not a man. It was a machine. A small-town machine built on silence and favors, and the unspoken agreement that certain people were protected and certain people were disposable. And the 17-year-old girl in the next room had spent 3 years on the disposable side of that equation. Call Reynolds, Ryder said. Tell her everything. Tell her the scope just changed. I'm already dialing. Ryder walked back into the waiting room. Ellie was still by the window. Saint had returned and was sitting across from her, his eyes dry now, but his hands still trembling in his lap. Deacon stood at the door like a monument. Ellie, Ryder said, your aunt, Janet, in Oregon. Ellie's face did something complicated. A flash of recognition, then confusion, then something that looked like a door opening that she'd assumed was locked forever. Aunt Janet? She's driving here. She'll be here by tomorrow morning. She wants to take you in, temporarily, legally, as your guardian while we fight this. I haven't talked to her since Mom's funeral. Wade said she didn't want anything to do with me. He said she blamed me for... She stopped. Her mouth opened and closed. He lied. Yeah. He said she stopped calling. She called 3 times. The sheriff's office told her the case was closed. Ellie pressed her hands flat against her thighs. Her fingers spread wide, pressing into the fabric of her jeans, the posture of someone trying to hold their body in place while their mind rearranges every memory they have. Every conversation with Wade about Aunt Janet. Every time he'd said, "She doesn't care about you." Every time he'd used her isolation as a weapon, cutting off the one family connection she had left. Building the walls of her prison not with locks and chains, but with lies so consistent and so cruel that they became indistinguishable from reality. He told me I was alone, she whispered. He told me there was nobody. He was wrong. He told me every day. Every single day. You've got nobody, Ellie. Nobody but me. You should be grateful. And Her voice broke. Not cracked. Broke. The way a branch breaks when the weight on it finally exceeds what the wood can hold. I believed him. For 3 years, I believed him. Ryder felt something inside him shift. Not break, not crack, but realign. The way a bone moves back into place after being set. Painful. Necessary. Correct. You're not alone, Ellie. You were never alone. He just made sure you couldn't see it. She looked at him with eyes that were filling with tears for the first time since the diner. Real tears. The kind that come not from sadness, but from the devastating relief of learning that the world is bigger than the cage you were kept in. Then Deacon's phone buzzed. He answered, listened. His face went tight. Ryder? What? Hatchet just picked up radio traffic on the scanner. 2 sheriff's vehicles dispatched from Black Hollow. Destination, Missoula. They're looking for Ellie, and they're looking for you. Ryder stood. How long? An hour, maybe less. They've got your description and the plate numbers from 3 of our bikes. Someone at the motel must have talked. The room contracted. The pale winter light from the window suddenly felt colder. Ellie's face went white, the bruised white of someone who has spent their life being hunted and recognizes the sound of the hunt starting again. If they find her before Janet gets here, Ghost said from the doorway, they return her to Wade. Legal guardian, custodial rights. The bolo gives them authority. And if they find me? They arrest you. Kidnapping charge. And everything we've built, the medical report, the evidence, the attorney, all of it becomes a sideshow to a criminal prosecution against you. Ryder looked at Ellie. Ellie looked at Ryder. And in that look was the same unspoken calculation. The math of 2 people who understood that the next 60 minutes would determine whether the last 24 hours had been a rescue or a trap. He turned to Ghost. His voice was calm. The calm of a man who has passed through panic and come out the other side into something harder. Call Reynolds. Get the emergency petition filed in the next 30 minutes. Get the medical report attached. Get everything Coyote has into the attorney's hands. And you? I'm getting Ellie out of this hospital before those deputies arrive. Saint drives. Deacon rides escort. We go somewhere they won't look. Where? Ryder looked at the floor, then at the ceiling, then at a point somewhere in the middle distance that only he could see. The clubhouse. Ghost's expression shifted. The clubhouse, the Iron Saints compound on the south end of Black Hollow, was the last place anyone would think to look for a girl being protected from the law, because it was the first place the law would assume she'd been taken against her will. It was a gamble. It was bringing a lamb into a den that the world had already decided was full of wolves. But it was also the most fortified, most watched, most defended space the Iron Saints had. And right now, defense was everything. That's a risk, Ghost said. Everything is a risk. The motel was a risk. The hospital was a risk. Sitting in that diner last night and deciding to care was a risk. The whole thing has been a risk since the moment I looked at her wrist and didn't look away. Ghost stared at him for 3 seconds. Then he nodded. Deacon, get the truck. Saint, clear her discharge. I don't care what forms need signing. We leave in 10 minutes. The hallway erupted into controlled motion. Deacon moved for the elevator. Saint moved for the nurse's station. Ghost moved for the stairwell, phone already at his ear, Reynolds' number already dialing. Ryder stayed in the room with Ellie. We have to move, he said. I know. She stood. The hospital gown shifted. He saw for just a moment the edge of a bruise on her collarbone that was the color of a thunderstorm. Then she pulled the blanket tighter, and it disappeared. Are you scared? She asked him. Not timidly, directly. The way someone asks a question when the answer matters more than the politeness of not asking. Ryder looked at her. This girl who had been beaten and burned and lied to and caged, who had watched her mother die and been told her aunt didn't love her, who had walked through rain to a diner at 2 a.m. and trusted a stranger with a scar on his jaw and a patch on his back. This girl was asking him if he was scared. Yeah, he said. I'm scared. Good. She almost smiled. The ghost of one. A flicker. Means you're paying attention. She was quoting Ghost. She'd heard it at the motel that morning, and the fact that she could take a line from a man she'd met 8 hours ago and throw it back at the man who had started all of this, there was something in that. Something that wasn't hope, exactly, but was standing in the place where hope would eventually grow. They moved through the hospital at a pace that looked casual and wasn't. Saint handled the discharge paperwork with the efficiency of a man who had spent years getting people out of bad situations in worse time frames. Deacon had the truck running at the side entrance, engine idling, heat blasting. Ghost was already on his bike outside, phone between his shoulder and his ear, talking to Reynolds while simultaneously signaling the remaining Iron Saints to mount up. Ellie climbed into the truck. Saint climbed in beside her. Deacon put it in gear. Ryder stood on the concrete for 1 second. Just one. He looked east toward Black Hollow, where 2 sheriff's vehicles were right now eating highway at speed, carrying badges and authority and a legal system that had already decided he was the criminal and Wade Mercer was the victim. He looked west toward the mountains, where the sky was turning the color of steel. And he looked at the truck, where through the rear window he could see the back of Ellie's head, small, dark-haired, fragile, alive. He got on his bike, kicked the engine. The Harley roared to life beneath him, and the sound that rolled through the hospital parking lot and across the city of Missoula was not a sound of flight. It was a sound of commitment, the sound of a man who had crossed every line, burned every bridge, and dismantled every exit, and was now riding straight toward the one thing he had left. A choice that couldn't be undone, and a girl who couldn't be abandoned. The Iron Saints pulled out in formation, chrome flashing, engines thundering. 15 bikes and a black truck heading east on Interstate 90, back toward Black Hollow, back toward the town where a monster sat in a farmhouse waiting for the law to bring him back his prisoner. But this time, they were bringing something Wade Mercer had never planned for. 47 photographs. A family attorney with a perfect record, a sister driving through the night from Oregon, and the testimony of a girl who had finally, after 3 years of silence, decided to speak. The only question was whether they'd make it to the clubhouse before the sheriff's deputies made it to them. And somewhere on that frozen highway, closing the distance with every mile, 2 sets of headlights moved toward each other like fists. They didn't make it to the clubhouse. 47 miles east of Missoula, where Interstate 90 narrows through the Garrison Junction corridor and the mountains press in from both sides like the walls of a hallway. That's getting smaller. Hatchett's voice crackled through the Bluetooth speaker clipped to Ghost's handlebar. Scanner just lit up. 2 units aren't coming from Black Hollow. They rerouted. They're on 90 eastbound out of Missoula. Behind you. 15 minutes. Ghost's left hand went up. Fist closed. The column slowed. Engines dropped from a roar to a growl, and the formation tightened, bikes pulling closer together like a school of fish sensing a predator in the water. Ryder pulled alongside Ghost. They didn't need to stop. They didn't need to discuss. They needed options, and they needed them in the next 60 seconds. Exit at Drummond, Ryder said over the wind. Highway 1 south. Takes us through Anaconda. Adds an hour but puts us off the interstate before they close the gap. Ghost shook his head. They'll have our plates flagged. First highway patrol unit that scans us. We're done. Then what? Ghost looked at the road ahead, then at the rear view mirror on his left handlebar. where the highway stretched back into nothing but gray sky and frozen asphalt. Then he did something Ryder had only seen him do twice in 15 years. He smiled. Not a happy smile. The kind of smile a man makes when he realizes the situation is so impossible that the only sane response is to stop being sane. "Boone," Ghost said into the Bluetooth, "you still have the keys to your cousin's ranch off Highway 1? The one past Phillipsburg?" Boone's voice came through, still groggy, perpetually half awake. "I got keys to everything. Which ranch?" "The one with the barn that fits 20 trucks." "The Cutler place?" Yeah. Nobody's been there since October. "We're going there. Now." The formation banked off the interstate at Drummond. The exit ramp curved downward like a hand guiding them off the main road and into the secondary network of two-lane highways that threaded through western Montana like veins through a body. Highway 1 south, past the town of Drummond, which was barely a town, a gas station, a bar, a post office, and a collection of houses that looked like they'd been placed there by someone who threw them from a distance. Past fences and fields and the skeletal remains of cottonwoods that had given up on leaves months ago. Into the kind of landscape where you could disappear if you knew where to look. And the Iron Saints knew where to look. The Cutler Ranch was 12 miles south of Phillipsburg, down a gravel road that didn't have a name, only a number, County Road 348. And the number was on a post that had been hit by a truck sometime in the last decade and now leaned at 45 degrees, pointing at the ground like it was giving up on directions entirely. The property was 80 acres of dead grass and frozen mud, bordered by barbed wire that sagged between posts like an old man's spine. The barn sat at the center, a massive structure, metal-sided, rust-streaked, big enough to hold farm equipment or cattle, or, today, 15 motorcycles, a black Chevy Silverado, and the collected fury of a brotherhood that had just gone from the highway to the underground. Boone unlocked the barn with a key that was attached to a ring that also held a bottle opener, a miniature wrench, and what appeared to be a bullet casing. The doors swung open on hinges that screamed like they were in pain. Inside, dirt floor, hay bales stacked against the far wall, a tractor that hadn't moved since the Clinton administration, and the smell of rust, animal, and cold. They rolled the bikes in. Every engine cut. The silence that followed was enormous, the kind of silence that only exists in rural Montana in winter, where the nearest human sound is miles away, and the only thing you can hear is the wind in your own breathing and the tick, tick, tick of cooling engines. Deacon pulled the truck inside. Saint helped Ellie out. She stood in the barn, blanket around her shoulders, hospital discharge papers in her hand, looking at 15 motorcycles and 15 men in a space that smelled like a century of agriculture, and she said nothing. There was nothing to say. They were fugitives now, all of them. Not legally, not yet, but functionally. They were hiding in a barn off a nameless road because the legal system that was supposed to protect a beaten child was instead hunting the people who had pulled her out of the fire. Ryder walked to the barn door and looked out at the road. Empty. The gravel stretched in both directions, white with frost, disappearing into the tree line. No dust clouds. No headlights. For now, they were invisible. For now. Ghost was on the phone with Reynolds before the last engine stopped ticking. He paced the length of the barn, his boots leaving prints in the dirt, his voice low and precise. Ryder couldn't hear the words, but he could read Ghost's body. The way his free hand opened and closed, the way his jaw worked between sentences, the way he stopped pacing twice and pressed his palm against his forehead like he was trying to hold his skull together. When he hung up, he stood still for 5 seconds. Then he walked to Ryder. Reynolds filed the emergency petition 20 minutes ago. Judge Caldwell's clerk accepted it. Hearing is set for tomorrow at 9 a.m. Missoula Courthouse. Tomorrow. But here's the problem. Reynolds says if Ellie doesn't appear in person at that hearing, the petition gets dismissed. And if the sheriff's office finds her before the hearing, they execute the bolo and return her to Wade. The hearing becomes moot. So we have to keep her hidden until 9 a.m. tomorrow and then walk her into a courthouse that's being watched by people who want to put me in handcuffs. That's the situation. Ryder looked at the barn, at the men inside it, at the girl sitting on a hay bale with a blanket and a dead phone, and the kind of courage that comes not from strength, but from having already survived the worst thing you can imagine, and deciding that surviving it once means you can survive it again. What about Janet, the aunt? Driving, Coyote's tracking her phone. She left Bend at noon. She's in Eastern Oregon right now, maybe 4 hours out. She'll be in Missoula by nightfall. Can Reynolds get her added to the petition? Already done. Janet Harlow is named as the proposed emergency guardian. If the judge grants it, custody transfers immediately. Wade's guardianship is suspended pending a full investigation. If. The word hung in the air of that barn like a breath that wouldn't dissolve. Coyote was set up in the corner of the barn, laptop balanced on a hay bale, phone charger running off the truck's auxiliary power, fingers moving across the keyboard with the focused urgency of a man who understood that every piece of information he found in the next 12 hours was a brick in a wall that either protected Ellie or buried Ryder. New development, Coyote said without looking up. Purcell, the former deputy. He's moving. Moving how? His phone pinged a cell tower in Drummond 40 minutes ago. The barn went quiet. Not the good kind of quiet. The kind of quiet that happens when 15 men simultaneously realize that the thing they were running from isn't behind them anymore. It's beside them. Drummond, Ghost repeated. We came through Drummond 30 minutes ago. I know. Is he following us? I can't tell direction from a cell ping, but Drummond is a one-intersection town. There are only 2 reasons to be there. You live there or you're passing through. Purcell lives in Missoula. Ryder's hands went into his pockets. His right hand found the shape of his phone. His left hand found nothing and closed around it anyway. He's tracking us. Or he's tracking Ellie's phone. Every eye in the barn turned to Ellie. She was still sitting on the hay bale. Her dead phone was in her lap. It's off, she said. It died last night. Doesn't matter, Coyote said. A phone that's powered off can still be pinged if the battery isn't physically removed. Most smartphones maintain a low-power state that responds to cell network queries. If Wade or Purcell have access to her phone account, and as her legal guardian, Wade absolutely does, they can request location data from the carrier. Saint was already moving. He took the phone from Ellie's lap, popped the case off, and looked at the back. No removable battery. Of course not. Modern phones were sealed, designed to be tracked, designed to be found, designed by engineers who never imagined that the person doing the finding might be the person the phone's owner was running from. We need to kill it, Saint said. Killing it won't help. The last ping was Drummond. That's already enough to narrow the search area. Then we need to move it. Ryder turned to Boone. Your cousin's place. How far is the nearest town in the opposite direction? Deer Lodge, 20 miles north. Give me the phone. Saint handed it to him. Ryder walked to the barn door, looked out at the empty road, and whistled, a short, sharp note that cut through the cold air. Drifter appeared beside him, lean, quiet, mid-30s, the kind of man who could ride through a rainstorm and come out the other side looking like he'd been sitting in a library. Drifter's skill set was simple and invaluable. He could go anywhere, do anything, and be forgotten by everyone who saw him. He was the club's ghost within the ghost's command. Take this phone to Deer Lodge. Don't turn it on. Just carry it. Leave it somewhere public, a gas station, a diner, anywhere with foot traffic. Then come back on a different route. Drifter took the phone. Didn't ask why. Didn't need to. He was on his bike and down the gravel road in under a minute, the sound of his engine fading into the distance like a whisper being swallowed by the wind. That buys us time, Ghost said. Not much. It buys us enough. The afternoon settled over the barn like a weight. The temperature inside was barely warmer than outside. Mid-20s, cold enough that breath hung visible in the air, and fingers went numb if you didn't keep them moving. Someone found an old wood stove in the corner and got it burning with hay and fence posts, and the heat it produced was modest but real, a small circle of warmth that the men gravitated toward, like planets orbiting a dim sun. Ellie sat closest to the stove. Saint had given her his jacket, the one without patches, the one he wore under his vest, a lined denim thing that swallowed her whole. She sat with her knees pulled up, arms wrapped around them, staring into the stove's open door where the fire cracked and popped and threw orange light across her face. Ryder sat against the wall 10 feet away, watching her. Not staring, watching. The way a man watches a horizon when he knows something is coming but doesn't know what. His phone buzzed. A number he didn't recognize. He almost didn't answer. Then he did. "Mr. Kane." A man's voice. Not Purcell, not Langford. Older, smoother. The kind of voice that had been trained to sound reasonable under all circumstances. "My name is Victor Ashwood. I represent Wade Mercer." Ryder's blood didn't go cold this time. It went hot, fast. The heat started in his chest and spread outward to his hands, his face, the base of his skull, and he had to close his eyes and breathe through it before he trusted himself to speak. "I know who you are." "Good. Then you know I'm calling to offer you a way out of a very difficult situation." "I'm listening." "You're currently harboring a minor child in violation of a custodial order. You've transported her across county lines. You've interfered with a lawful guardian's parental rights. These are serious charges, Mr. Kane. Felony charges. The kind that follow a man for the rest of his life. But is there a point coming, or do you charge by the word?" A pause. "The kind that costs $400 an hour. The point is this. Mr. Mercer is a reasonable man. He's a concerned father who wants his daughter home. He's not interested in pressing charges against you or your associates, provided Ellie is returned to his custody by 6 p.m. today. You bring her home, you walk away, and this entire matter disappears. No arrest, no charges, no record. A clean slate." Ryder opened his eyes, looked across the barn at Ellie, who was staring into the fire with the blank, exhausted face of a child who had spent her life being bargained over by men who saw her as property. "You done?" "I'm offering you freedom, Mr. Kane. I suggest you take it seriously." "Let me tell you what I take seriously." Ryder's voice dropped, not to a whisper, to the low, grinding register that men who have been in combat recognize as the sound someone makes right before they stop talking and start acting. "I take seriously that your client has been beating a 17-year-old girl for 3 years. I take seriously that there are 47 photographs documenting injuries that include healed fractures and cigarette burns. I take seriously that your client's wife announced she was leaving him and died in a car accident the next day, and the deputy who investigated that accident now works for your client's shell company. And I take very seriously that the same deputy has been making weekly phone calls to the officer who closed both CPS complaints against your client." Silence on the line. Not the confident silence of a lawyer letting a rant burn itself out. The jagged silence of a man who has just heard something he didn't expect to hear. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Yeah, you do. And in about 16 hours, a judge is going to know too. So here's my counteroffer, counselor. You tell Wade Mercer that the girl is gone. She's not coming back. Not today, not tomorrow, not ever. And if he's smart, if he has any survival instinct left in that rotten little brain, he'll spend the next 16 hours packing a bag instead of making phone calls. Because what's coming for him isn't me. It's not my club. It's a courtroom. And in that courtroom, every bruise, every burn, every buried investigation, and every dirty phone call is going to be laid out under fluorescent lights where the whole world can see them. That's my offer. Take it or don't." He hung up. His hand was shaking, not from fear, from the effort of not throwing the phone through the barn wall. Ghost was beside him, had been beside him the whole time, listening. His face was unreadable, but his eyes were calculating. Running scenarios, weighing variables, measuring the distance between what Ryder had just done and what it was going to cost. "You just told Wade's lawyer everything we have." "I know." "Which means Wade now knows everything we have." "I know." "Which means he's going to spend the next 16 hours not packing a bag, but destroying evidence, coaching witnesses, and coordinating with Purcell and Sutter to make sure that courtroom never sees any of it." Ryder looked at Ghost, and in that look was something Ghost had seen before. Not often, not casually, but in the moments that defined whether a man was who he claimed to be. It was the look of someone who had stopped calculating and started committing. The look of a man standing at the edge of a cliff, not because he wanted to jump, but because he'd realized there was no ground behind him anymore. "Then we don't give him 16 hours. Ryder, Listen to me. Reynolds has the petition filed. The hearing is at 9 a.m. Janet Harlow will be in Missoula by tonight. The medical report is documented. Coyote's research is compiled. Everything we need for that courtroom is already in motion. But you're right. Wade isn't going to sit still. He's going to burn it down. The question is whether we let him set the fires or whether we take the match out of his hand. How? We go to the farmhouse. The barn went silent. Not gradually. Instantly. Like someone had thrown a switch that killed all sound. 15 men, a girl, and a fire that suddenly sounded very loud. You told Reynolds no farmhouse, Ghost said. Quiet. Measured. The voice of a man trying to hold a grenade together. Reynolds told me no vigilante rides, no shows of force, no confrontation. Ryder paused. I'm not talking about confrontation. I'm talking about witness. Explain. Wade is going to destroy evidence tonight. Whatever's in that house, or records, documents, anything that connects him to Purcell, to the shell company, to Karen's death, it'll be gone by morning. We can't stop him legally. We don't have subpoena power. We don't have a warrant. But we have something else. What? Eyes. Cameras. 15 men who can surround that property and document everything that happens. Every car that comes or goes. Every bag of trash that gets carried out. Every file that gets burned. We don't touch him. We don't speak to him. We don't set foot on his property. We stand on public road and we record every move he makes from now until 9 a.m. Ghost stared at him. The calculation behind his eyes intensified. Processing legality, risk, optics. The probability that 15 bikers parked on a public road outside a farmhouse at night would be perceived as surveillance rather than intimidation. Public road, Ghost said. Public road. Legal distance. Cameras rolling. If he destroys evidence, we document it. If Purcell shows up, we document it. If Sutter shows up in his sheriff's cruiser, we document a county deputy coordinating with a man accused of child abuse. And tomorrow morning, Reynolds walks into that courtroom with not just 47 photographs, but a real-time record of a cover-up in progress. The fire cracked. A log shifted. Sparks flew upward and died against the cold metal ceiling. Ghost looked at Deacon. Deacon's face was stone, but his eyes were alive. The eyes of a man who had spent his whole life enforcing rules and had just been offered a mission that bent them without breaking them. Legal? Ghost asked. Public road, Deacon said. No trespassing, no direct contact. Recording from public land is protected. It's the same thing journalists do at protests. Same thing anyone does with a dash cam. Risky? Everything's risky. Standing in this barn is risky. But if Wade Mercer spends tonight destroying evidence while 15 cameras record it, we hand Reynolds a case that no judge in Montana can ignore. And we do it without laying a finger on him. Ghost turned to Ellie. She had been listening to everything. Her face was pale but focused. The face of someone who has spent years being talked about in rooms she wasn't supposed to be in and was now, for the first time, present for the decisions being made about her life. Ellie, this involves your home. Your stepfather. I need to know if you're okay with this. She looked at the fire, then at Ryder, then at Ghost, then at the 15 men standing in a barn in the middle of nowhere who had rearranged their lives in the last 20 hours to stand between her and a man who had spent 3 years making her wish she'd never been born. He burned my mom's photo albums, she said. Her voice was steady, not strong, steady. The steadiness of someone who has made a decision and is holding on to it with both hands. A month after she died, I came home from school and they were gone. All of them. Every picture of her. He said they were clutter. He said we needed to move on. She paused. I don't have a single picture of my mother. The barn was silent. Document everything, she said. I want him to know what it feels like when someone takes things that belong to you. It was the hardest sentence Ryder Kane had ever heard a 17-year-old say. They moved at dusk. The sun dropped behind the mountains like a stone falling into water. Fast, final, leaving nothing behind but a bruised sky that faded to black within 30 minutes. The Iron Saints rolled out of the barn in a column that looked different than it had that morning. Tighter, quieter. The energy had changed. It was no longer the broad, defiant energy of a brotherhood riding in formation. It was the focused, contracted energy of men on a specific mission with specific rules and specific stakes. Ellie stayed at the barn with Saint and Boone. The stove was burning. The truck was gassed. If anything went wrong, if a call came that the plan had collapsed, Saint had instructions to drive her to Missoula directly and deliver her to Reynolds' office. No stops, no detours, no matter what was happening on the road behind them. Ryder had stood in front of her before leaving. He hadn't said goodbye. He'd said, "I'll see you in the morning." And she'd said, "You better." And in those two exchanges was everything that had built between them in 20 hours. Not a father-daughter bond, not a rescuer-victim dynamic, but something rarer and more fragile. The bond of two people who had looked at each other's wreckage and decided, without ceremony or sentiment, to stand in the debris together. The ride to Black Hollow took 90 minutes in the dark. The temperature had dropped to the teens. Ryder's face was numb beneath his helmet, his fingers locked around the grips through sheer stubbornness, his thighs burning from the cold that seeped through denim like water through paper. But he didn't feel it. Not really. The cold was just background noise. The foreground was occupied entirely by the image of a farmhouse at the end of a rural road, and the man inside it who was, at this very moment, trying to erase the evidence of what he'd done. They reached Black Hollow at 8:17 p.m. The town was dead. Streets empty, storefronts dark, the only light coming from the gas and go on Route 93 and the neon sign at Rosie's Diner, which still flickered its broken name into the void like a signal no one was receiving. They rode through town without stopping, a silent procession of headlights and exhaust, and the few people who saw them, a bartender locking up, a teenager at the gas station, an old man walking a dog that was too small for Montana, watched them pass with expressions that ranged from curiosity to unease. Wade Mercer's farmhouse sat at the end of County Road 7, a half-mile past the last neighbor, surrounded by 12 acres of flat, frozen land that in summer would have been hayfields, but in January was just white emptiness stretching to the tree line. The house itself was a two-story structure, white siding gone gray, a porch that wrapped around the front, windows lit from inside with the yellow glow of kitchen lights. A truck sat in the driveway. A sedan sat beside it. Two vehicles. Wade lived alone with Ellie. Two vehicles meant company. Ghost raised his fist. The column stopped on the public road 50 yards from the property line. Engines idled. Headlights stayed on, 12 beams of light cutting through the darkness, pointed at the farmhouse like spotlights on a stage. Inside the house, a curtain moved. Someone was watching. "Cameras," Ghost said into the Bluetooth. "Every angle, license plates on both vehicles. And nobody sets foot past that fence line." Phones came out, cameras activated. Red recording lights blinked to life like small eyes opening in the dark. 12 men on 12 motorcycles, parked on a public road, recording everything in front of them with the patient, methodical focus of men who had been trained by war, by life, by the accumulation of injustice, to watch and wait and never blink. Coyote had the sedan's plates in under a minute. Registered to Dale Purcell. Ryder's jaw tightened. Purcell was inside, the former deputy who had buried Karen Mercer's accident investigation, the man who made weekly calls to Deputy Sutter. He was in that house right now with Wade Mercer, and the fact that he was there on this night, of all nights, told Ryder everything about what was happening behind those lit windows. They were cleaning house, literally and figuratively. Whatever documents, whatever records, whatever digital evidence connected Wade Mercer to the systematic destruction of his wife's memory, his stepdaughter's body, and the investigations that should have stopped him years ago. It was being destroyed right now, behind those curtains, by two men who had spent 3 years believing that no one was watching. They were wrong. For 20 minutes, nothing happened. The Harleys idled, the cameras recorded. The farmhouse sat in its circle of yellow light like an island in a sea of black, and the only sound was the wind coming off the flats, carrying the smell of frozen earth and dead grass, and something that might have been smoke from a fireplace, or might have been something else entirely. Then the front door opened. Wade Mercer stepped onto the porch. He was exactly what the photograph had promised. Thick-necked, small-eyed, unremarkable. A man who could disappear into any crowd, any barbecue, any parent-teacher conference and be remembered by no one. He was wearing a flannel shirt untucked over jeans and work boots, and he stood on his porch looking at 12 motorcycle headlights, with an expression that started as confusion and quickly hardened into something meaner. Behind him, in the doorway, a second figure appeared. Taller, thinner, wearing a dark jacket. Dale Purcell. He stayed in the shadows of the door frame, half visible, his face catching the kitchen light in fragments. Wade stepped to the edge of the porch. His hands were at his sides. His chin was up. The posture of a man who has decided to perform courage rather than feel it. "This is private property," he shouted. His voice carried across the frozen distance, thin and metallic. "You're trespassing." Nobody responded. 12 engines idled. 12 cameras recorded. The silence from the road was more intimidating than any shout could have been, because it was the silence of men who were not there to talk. "I said you're trespassing. I'll call the sheriff." Ghost's voice came through the Bluetooth, calm as morning. "Let him." Wade stared at the road for another 30 seconds. Then he pulled out his phone, made a call, talked for 2 minutes, gesturing at the road, his voice carrying in fragments. Motorcycles, harassment, my property. Then he hung up and went back inside. Purcell's shadow disappeared from the doorway. The door closed. "Sheriff's response time to this address is 18 to 22 minutes, Coyote said through the speaker, based on previous call logs. "Good," Ghost said. "That gives us 18 minutes of uninterrupted recording. And when the sheriff arrives, we're standing on a public road, not trespassing, not threatening, exercising our right to be on a county road with cameras." 7 minutes later, something happened that Ryder would remember for the rest of his life. The back door of the farmhouse opened. A light went on. A floodlight mounted above the rear entrance, throwing a harsh white cone across the backyard. In that light, 2 figures moved. Wade and Purcell. They were carrying boxes. Not large boxes. The kind you'd use for files, documents, the paper trail of a life, or the paper trail of a crime. They carried them from the back door to a spot in the yard where a metal drum sat, the kind farmers use for burning brush. One of the men, Purcell, based on the height, opened the first box and began feeding its contents into the drum. A lighter sparked. Paper caught. Fire bloomed in the metal drum, orange and hungry, and smoke rose into the black sky like a signal. "Are you getting this?" Ryder said. "Every frame," Coyote said. "Zoom's at max. I can see the letterheads on the papers." They were burning documents. At 8:47 p.m., on a night when a court petition for emergency custody had been filed against Wade Mercer, the petitioned guardian and a former law enforcement officer connected to his wife's death investigation were standing in the backyard burning boxes of paperwork while 12 cameras recorded every second from a public road 50 yards away. Ryder felt something in his chest that he couldn't name. It wasn't triumph. It was too bitter for that. It wasn't anger. He'd passed anger hours ago. It was the terrible, exhausting clarity of watching a guilty man prove his guilt in real time, the slow-motion confirmation that everything you feared was true and the world you're trying to protect someone from is exactly as broken as you thought it was. They burned 4 boxes in 12 minutes. Then Purcell's head snapped toward the road. He'd realized the headlights were still there. He said something to Wade. Wade looked up. Even from 50 yards, Ryder could see the change in his body language, the stiffening, the panic, the dawning realization that the men on the road weren't there to intimidate. They were there to watch, and they had been watching everything. Wade moved fast. He kicked the burning drum over. Embers scattered across the frozen grass. Purcell grabbed the remaining box and ran inside. The back door slammed shut. The floodlight went off. But it was too late. 12 cameras had captured 12 minutes of 2 men destroying evidence. The footage was already being uploaded to Coyote's encrypted cloud server, duplicated to 3 backup drives, and forwarded to Margaret Reynolds' secure email with a subject line that read, "Urgent, video evidence, Mercer/Purcell, evidence destruction in progress." 3 minutes later, headlights appeared on County Road 7, a sheriff's cruiser moving fast, light bar flashing blue and red. It pulled up to the row of motorcycles and stopped. A door opened. A deputy stepped out. Ryder recognized the name on the badge before he read it. He knew. He already knew. Deputy Ray Sutter, the same deputy who had closed both CPS complaints, the same deputy who had weekly phone calls with Dale Purcell, the same deputy who, at this exact moment, was standing on a public road in front of 12 bikers with cameras and had absolutely no idea that every word he was about to say was being recorded from 6 different angles. "Evening, gentlemen." Sutter's voice was professional, controlled, the voice of a man who had practiced authority until it fit like a uniform. He was mid-40s, medium build, the kind of physical presence that relied on the badge rather than the body. "Got a complaint about motorcycles blocking the road and harassing a resident." Ghost dismounted, slowly, deliberately, the way a man approaches a negotiation he intends to win. He pulled his gloves off one finger at a time and tucked them into his belt. "Evening, deputy. We're not blocking anything. Road's open. We're parked on the shoulder of a public county road. No obstruction. Mr. Mercer says you've been shining lights at his house and making threats. We haven't spoken a word. Not to Mr. Mercer, not to each other, not to anyone. We're sitting on motorcycles on a public road. Since when is that a crime?" Sutter's eyes moved down the line of bikes, counting, assessing. His hand rested on his belt, not on his weapon, but near it, in the practiced posture of a man who wanted you to know it was there. "There's a BOLO out for a man named Ryder Kane, in connection with a missing minor. Would any of you gentlemen be Mr. Kane?" Silence. 12 men on 12 motorcycles, faces shadowed by helmets and the darkness between headlight beams. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. "I'll ask again. Is Ryder Kane present?" Ghost took a half step forward. Not aggressive, positioning. "Deputy, we're private citizens on a public road. We're not required to identify ourselves. Absent reasonable suspicion of a crime. Sitting on a motorcycle isn't a crime. Being in a motorcycle club isn't a crime. And recording a public scene from a public road, which, for the record, is what we're doing, is a constitutionally protected activity." Sutter's jaw tightened. The professional veneer cracked, just slightly. A flash of something underneath that looked less like a lawman doing his job and more like a man protecting something that wasn't the law. "I'm going to need you all to disperse. Now." "On what authority? What statute are we violating?" "I'm issuing a lawful order to—" "A lawful order requires a legal basis. What's yours?" Sutter and Ghost stood 3 feet apart on a frozen road in the dark, and between them was every tension that had been building since Ryder Kane looked at a girl's wrist in a diner 24 hours ago. The tension between law and justice, between systems and people, between the way things are supposed to work and the way they actually work when the people in charge are the ones breaking them. Sutter's radio crackled. He reached for it, turned his back to Ghost for half a second, spoke into it. When he turned back, something had changed. His posture was stiffer. His hand was closer to his weapon. "I've got backup en route. You have 5 minutes to leave this road, or I'm placing every one of you under arrest for failure to obey a lawful order. Then I suggest you call your backup and explain that you're about to arrest 12 citizens for exercising their First Amendment rights on camera." Ghost held up his phone. The screen was recording. Because this footage, along with the footage of the 2 men inside that house burning documents 10 minutes ago, is currently being reviewed by an attorney who will be filing it with the court first thing tomorrow morning, along with phone records showing weekly calls between your personal cell phone and a former deputy named Dale Purcell. Sutter's face went white. Not metaphorically. The blood drained from his skin with a speed that was almost clinical. The physiological response of a man who has just heard the sound of his own career, his own freedom, and his own carefully constructed life collapsing like a building being demolished from the foundation up. "What did you say?" "You heard me, deputy." The road was silent except for idling engines and the wind. Sutter stood in the crosshairs of 12 cameras and the knowledge that everything he did next would be reviewed, analyzed, and entered into evidence. His hand, which had been moving toward his weapon, stopped. His fingers opened and closed. His breathing was visible in the cold air. Fast, shallow, the breathing of a man whose fight-or-flight response had been activated and who was realizing, in real time, that neither option led anywhere good. He took a step back, then another. He reached his cruiser, opened the door, sat inside for a full minute, the dome light illuminating his face through the windshield, A face that was processing the rapid, irreversible implosion of a conspiracy that had held together for 3 years on the strength of silence and mutual protection, and was now coming apart because a biker in a diner had looked at a girl's wrist and refused to look away. The cruiser's engine started, the light bar went dark, and Deputy Ray Sutter pulled off County Road 7 and drove into the night without another word. Ghost watched the taillights disappear. Then he turned to Ryder, who had been sitting on his bike through the entire exchange, silent, recording, his face hidden by shadow and helmet, his heart hammering against his ribs with a force that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with the realization that they had just stared down the edge of the system, and the system had blinked. "He's running," Ryder said. "He's panicking. There's a difference. Panicking men make phone calls. He's going to call Purcell. Purcell is going to call Wade. And in about 15 minutes, everyone inside that house is going to understand that the evidence they just burned was captured on video, and the deputy they were counting on just retreated from a public road on camera." Which means what? Which means cornered men do desperate things. As if the night itself had been listening, the front door of the farmhouse opened again. Wade Mercer stood on the porch for the second time. But he wasn't shouting this time. He wasn't performing. He was holding something at his side, barrel down, stock against his hip. A shotgun. Every camera on the road locked onto it. Every man on every motorcycle felt the air change, the temperature dropping not from weather but from the introduction of a variable that turned a surveillance operation into a potential combat zone. "Nobody moves," Ghost said through the Bluetooth. His voice was ice. "Cameras stay on. Nobody dismounts. Nobody speaks." Wade stood on the porch with the shotgun and 12 headlights illuminating him like a man on trial, and the night held its breath. And somewhere inside that house, Dale Purcell was either talking him down or winding him up. And somewhere on a highway, Janet Harlow was driving toward Missoula with the legal authority to take Ellie away from this man forever. And somewhere in a barn 20 miles south, a 17-year-old girl was sitting by a fire, waiting for a phone call that would tell her whether the men who had promised to protect her were still alive. And Ryder Kane sat on his motorcycle in the freezing dark, 50 yards from a man with a shotgun, and thought about Lily, thought about the hallway in Butte, thought about being 12 years old and powerless, thought about every day since then that he had spent trying to become the opposite of powerless, harder, stronger, more dangerous, more capable, building himself into a weapon designed to stand between monsters and the people they fed on. He had spent 14 years becoming this moment, and the moment was here. The shotgun was real. The man holding it was real. The choice to stay, to stand, to refuse to abandon the road even when the road had become the most dangerous place in Montana, was the only choice Ryder had ever been building toward. He killed his engine, swung his leg over the bike, stood. "Ryder!" Ghost's voice, sharp, a command. "Don't!" But Ryder was already walking, boots on frozen gravel, hands visible at his sides, no weapon, no phone, nothing but a body that had survived 2 wars, one in a desert, one inside himself, and a pair of eyes locked on the man on the porch with the same gray, cold, creek water focus that had kept him alive in every firefight, every nightmare, every 3 a.m. hour when the darkness tried to convince him that staying alive wasn't worth the effort. He stopped at the fence line, the property boundary, the line he had promised Reynolds he wouldn't cross. 50 feet separated him from Wade Mercer. 50 feet and a shotgun and 3 years of brutality and a dead woman and a buried investigation and a 17-year-old girl's entire future. "You want to pull that trigger," Ryder said. His voice carried across the frozen yard, steady, low, raw with something that wasn't anger and wasn't calm, but was the thing that exists in the space between them. The controlled fury of a man who has accepted that the next 30 seconds might be his last and has decided that those 30 seconds belong to someone else. "You go through me." Wade Mercer stood on his porch, shotgun in his hands, looking at a man who wasn't moving, wasn't flinching, wasn't giving him anything to react to except the unbearable weight of being seen. And behind that man, 12 headlights and 12 cameras, and the accumulated force of a brotherhood that had come not to fight, but to witness. And witnessing, it turned out, was the most terrifying thing of all. The shotgun trembled. Wade's hands shook. The barrel drifted left, then right, searching for the conviction to do what his fear was telling him to do. But conviction requires certainty, and certainty requires the belief that you will get away with it. And standing in 12 beams of light with 12 cameras recording, and a man at the fence line who looked like he had already died once and come back harder, there was no getting away with anything. Not tonight, not ever again. The shotgun lowered, inch by inch, the barrel dropping like a flag being lowered in surrender, until the stock hit the porch floor and Wade Mercer's hands were empty and his shoulders were shaking, and the sound he was making wasn't crying and wasn't screaming, but something between the two. The sound of a man whose power has been stripped away completely, publicly, irrevocably, in the lights of 12 motorcycles on a frozen road in the middle of nowhere, Montana. And Ryder Kane stood at that fence line, breathing steam into the night air, his heart slamming against his ribs, his eyes burning from cold and exhaustion and 14 years of grief, and he did not cross the line. He did not touch the man. He did not say another word. He turned, walked back to his bike, sat down, put his hands on the grips, and somewhere behind him, the front door of the farmhouse closed for the last time. The farmhouse door stayed closed, the shotgun stayed on the porch, and the night kept breathing its frozen breath across County Road 7 like nothing had happened, like a man hadn't just aimed a weapon at another man, like the distance between a pulled trigger and a life ending hadn't been measured in the trembling of fingers rather than feet, like the world hadn't just tilted on its axis and settled into a new configuration where everything that came before was one story and everything that came after was another. Ryder sat on his bike for 11 minutes without moving. He knew because he counted. Not intentionally, his mind, unable to process what his body had just done, defaulted to the only thing it could control. Numbers, seconds, breaths, heartbeats. The mechanical rhythm of a man rebooting himself after a system crash. His hands were still on the grips. His knuckles were white. Not from cold, from the fact that letting go would mean acknowledging that his hands were shaking, and if his hands were shaking, then the wall he had built between himself and the terror of what had just happened would crack, and he was not ready for that crack. Not yet, not here, not in front of 15 men who needed him to be the thing they believed he was. Ghost pulled his bike beside Ryder's, didn't speak, just sat there, engine idling, the low rumble of the Harley filling the space between them like a shared heartbeat. After a while, a minute, maybe two, Ghost reached over and put his gloved hand on Ryder's shoulder, squeezed once. Let go. That was all. That was enough. Coyote's voice came through the Bluetooth. Reynolds just confirmed, all footage received. She's adding it to the emergency petition as a supplemental filing. She says, and I'm quoting, "This changes everything." Define everything, Ghost said. She's calling the state attorney general's office first thing in the morning. Not the county attorney, the state. She says the Purcell-Sutter connection, combined with the evidence destruction footage, takes this out of local jurisdiction. She's requesting a state-level investigation into Karen Mercer's death, the CPS complaint closures, and what she's calling systemic obstruction of child protective services by county law enforcement personnel. Ryder heard the words, filed them, couldn't feel them yet. The feeling would come later, in a shower, in a bed, in some quiet moment when the adrenaline finally ebbed and the magnitude of what had been set in motion hit him with the force of something that had been falling for a very long time. What about tonight? Ryder asked. His voice was raw, like he'd been screaming, even though he'd barely spoken above a conversational tone. Reynolds says maintain position until midnight, document any further activity, then pull back. She doesn't want us here when daylight comes. The optics shift in the morning. At night, we're surveillance. In daylight, we're intimidation. She's very specific about the distinction. They stayed. The farmhouse went dark at 10:14 p.m., every light inside switching off in sequence, starting with the kitchen and ending with a second-floor window that Ryder stared at for a long time, because he knew, with the certainty of a man who had mapped damage in every room he'd ever entered, that it was Ellie's bedroom, the room where the bruises happened, the room where the cigarette burns were applied in a line so deliberate they looked like notation, the room that a 17-year-old girl had walked out of for the last time on a rainy night and would never walk into again. At 11:48 p.m., Purcell's sedan pulled out of the driveway. It turned north on County Road 7, away from the motorcycles, and disappeared into the darkness. Coyote logged the time, the direction, and the plate number. 12 minutes later, Wade's truck followed. Same direction, same darkness. The farmhouse sat empty and unlit, a dead building at the end of a dead road, and the silence that surrounded it was the silence of a place that had finally been abandoned by the people who had made it dangerous. "They're running," Ghost said. "Let them," Ryder said. "Reynolds will find them. The state will find them. That's not our job anymore." At midnight, the Iron Saints rolled off County Road 7 in formation. Engines rumbled through the dark, headlights carving tunnels in the blackness, and the sound of 15 motorcycles leaving Wade Mercer's road was the sound of a siege being lifted, not by retreat, but by completion. They had come to witness. They had witnessed. The cameras held the truth now, and truth, once recorded, cannot be unburned. They rode south, back to the barn, back to the hay bales and the wood stove and the girl who was waiting. Ryder didn't remember the ride. He would try later and find only fragments. The white line of the road, the red taillight of Ghost's bike ahead of him, the cold that had stopped being painful and become simply a state of being, like gravity or grief. His body rode the motorcycle the way his body did most things, out of habit, out of training, out of the stubborn refusal to stop functioning that had kept him alive through 2 combat tours, 14 years of nightmares, and 1 night on a frozen road in Montana that had demanded more of him than any battlefield ever had. They reached the barn at 1:17 a.m. Boone had the doors open. The stove was still burning. Saint was in the doorway silhouetted by firelight, and the look on his face when he saw the column approaching, the relief, the exhaustion, the particular expression of a man who has been sitting alone with a scared child for 6 hours, imagining every possible version of what might be happening to his brothers, was something Ryder would carry for the rest of his life. Ellie was asleep, curled on a bed of hay bales that Saint had arranged into something approaching a mattress, covered with 2 blankets and Deacon's jacket, her face slack and peaceful in a way that Ryder had never seen it before. Not the tension sleep of someone listening for footsteps, not the survival sleep of someone who keeps one ear open and one hand near the edge of the bed. Real sleep. The kind that happens when the body finally believes it is safe enough to let go. He didn't wake her. He sat against the wall across from her, his back against cold metal, his legs stretched out, his hands in his lap, and he watched her sleep the way a sentry watches a perimeter. Not because he expected danger, but because watching was the only thing left to do, and doing it felt like the most important duty he had ever been given. Ghost sat beside him, shoulder to shoulder. The wall was cold against their backs. The fire cracked. Somewhere outside, an owl called into the silence with a sound that was lonelier than any human voice Ryder had ever heard. "You walked toward a shotgun," Ghost said quietly. "Yeah. I told you not to." "Yeah. You could have died." "I know." Ghost was quiet for a long time. Then, "Was it worth it?" Ryder looked at Ellie, at the rise and fall of her breathing, at the way her hand curled beneath her chin like a child half her age, at the faint line of a bruise still visible on her wrist above the edge of the blanket. "Ask me again in 20 years, he said, "when she's alive and free, and none of this is the biggest thing in her story anymore. Ask me then." Ghost nodded, closed his eyes. Within 5 minutes, he was asleep, sitting up, shoulder against Ryder's, chin on his chest, the posture of a soldier sleeping in a forward position, the posture of a man who trusts the man beside him enough to close his eyes. Ryder didn't sleep. He sat in that barn with his brothers around him and a sleeping girl across from him, and the weight of everything he had done and everything that was coming pressing down on his chest like a hand. And he thought about Lily, not the way he usually thought about her, in fragments, in nightmares, in the flashbulb images of a hallway and a closed door and a Red Cross message read in the dirt. He thought about her whole, her laugh, which had been loud and sudden and always surprised people who expected a quiet girl. Her habit of drawing on her sneakers with permanent markers until they were more art than shoe. The way she used to follow him around the house when she was small, her hand wrapped around his index finger, trusting him to lead her wherever they were going. He thought about the last thing she'd said to him. Not "help me," not "save me." She'd said, "It's okay, Ryder. It's not your fault." She'd said it on the phone 2 days before he shipped out, and he had carried those words across an ocean and a desert, and 14 years, and they had never once felt true. They still didn't. Maybe they never would. But sitting in that barn, looking at a girl who was alive because he had looked at her wrist and not looked away, he felt something shift in the place where those words lived. Not a resolution, not forgiveness. Just a small, barely perceptible movement, like a door that had been sealed shut for 14 years, opening 1 centimeter. Not enough to walk through, but enough to let light in. Dawn came slowly. The eastern sky turned from black to gray to the pale, washed-out blue of a winter morning in Montana. Frost covered the gravel road outside the barn. The mountains in the distance were white-capped and indifferent, the way mountains always are. Too old and too large to care about the small, desperate dramas of the humans at their feet. At 6:22 a.m., Coyote's phone rang. He answered, listened, and walked to Ryder. "Janet Harlow just crossed the Montana border. She'll be in Missoula by 8. Ryder stood. Every joint in his body ached. His back was a topography of pain from 10 hours against a metal wall. His hands were stiff, his eyes were gritty, and his face felt like it belonged to a man 20 years older than the one who had walked into Rosie's diner 2 nights ago. He walked to Ellie, crouched beside her, touched her shoulder gently, the way you touch something you're afraid of breaking. "Ellie, wake up." Her eyes opened. Not the sharp, panicked eyes of the diner, the slow, confused eyes of someone surfacing from a depth they hadn't expected to reach. She blinked, looked at him, looked at the barn, looked at the men sleeping against walls and on hay bales around her, leather jackets creased, faces slack, the collective exhaustion of a brotherhood that had spent 36 hours running on coffee and fury, and the stubborn belief that protecting one person was worth risking everything. "Is it over?" she asked. "Not yet, but the hard part is." "What's left?" "A courtroom, a judge, and your Aunt Janet, who drove all night from Oregon and is about to walk into a courthouse in Missoula ready to take you home." Ellie sat up. The blankets fell away. Deacon's jacket slid off her shoulders. She was still wearing the hospital gown under Saint's denim jacket, and she looked exactly like what she was, a child who had been through a war and come out the other side not unscathed but upright. "Home," she said, like she was tasting the word, testing it, checking whether it still meant something after 3 years of it meaning the opposite. "Home," Ryder confirmed. They drove to Missoula in the early morning light. The truck first, then the bikes, a convoy moving through the Montana countryside at a pace that was neither fast nor slow, but deliberate, the way people move when they're carrying something fragile and irreplaceable. The sun climbed above the mountains and threw long shadows across the highway, and the air was cold but clean, sharp with pine and frost. And for the first time in 2 days, the sky was clear. Not a cloud in it, just blue stretching endlessly in every direction. The kind of sky that makes you feel like the world might be larger and more generous than your worst experiences have led you to believe. They reached Missoula at 8:34 a.m. The courthouse was a stone building on Broadway, solid and unlovely, the kind of architecture that exists not to inspire but to endure. Reynolds was waiting on the steps. She was wearing the same navy suit, and in her hands was a file that was now almost 2 inches thick. Medical reports, Coyote's research, the video footage from County Road 7, phone records, property filings, and the statement of Janet Harlow, who was standing beside her. Janet Harlow was 41 years old. She had Karen Mercer's eyes, brown, warm, the kind that crinkle when they smile and flood when they hurt. She was shorter than Ryder expected, and she was shaking. Not from cold, from the accumulated tremor of a woman who had driven 11 hours through the night to reach a niece she'd been told didn't want her, in a courthouse where a man she'd suspected of killing her sister was about to face a reckoning that was 3 years overdue. Ellie got out of the truck, stood on the sidewalk, looked at her aunt. Neither of them moved for 5 seconds. Then Janet made a sound, a single, inarticulate syllable that contained her sister's name and her niece's name and 3 years of grief and guilt and helplessness. And Ellie crossed the distance between them in 4 steps, and they were holding each other on the courthouse steps, with a force that suggested they were trying to compress all the lost time into a single embrace. Ryder watched from beside his bike. He didn't approach. This wasn't his moment. This was the moment that existed because of his moment, but belonged entirely to two people who shared blood and loss and the particular agony of having been separated by a man who understood that isolation was the most effective weapon in his arsenal. Ghost stood beside him, arms crossed, watching. "Reynolds says we should stay outside," Ghost said. "The courtroom doesn't need leather jackets." "I know." "She also says the state attorney general's office opened a preliminary investigation at 7 this morning. Based on the video footage and Coyote's documentation, they've issued a preservation order for all records related to Karen Mercer's accident, and they've requested Deputy Sutter's personnel file." "Sutter?" "Resigned an hour ago, walked into the sheriff's office, put his badge on the desk, and walked out without a word." Ryder closed his eyes, opened them. "Purcell?" "Unknown. His car was found at a gas station in Helena at 5 a.m. Empty, engine cold. Coyote thinks he switched vehicles. State Patrol is looking." "And Wade?" Ghost was quiet for a moment. "Wade Mercer was picked up by state troopers at 4:17 a.m. at the Canadian border crossing in Sweetgrass. He had a suitcase, $12,000 in cash, and a passport that was issued 6 weeks ago." The information settled into Ryder's body not as surprise but as confirmation, the final piece of a puzzle that had been assembling itself since the moment Coyote found the shell company. A man who applies for a passport 6 weeks before his stepdaughter runs away is a man who has been planning his exit for longer than anyone knew. A man who runs for the Canadian border with cash is not a man who expects the system to protect him anymore. It is a man who knows the system has failed him the way it once served him, completely and irreversibly. He's in custody? State custody, not county. Reynolds made sure of that. She didn't trust the local system to hold him, and based on what we know about Sutter and Purcell, she was right. Ryder leaned against his bike. The chrome was cold against his back. The morning sun was weak but present, and it fell across his face with a warmth that was more symbolic than thermal. The kind of warmth that exists not because it's strong enough to heat you, but because it's there at all. The hearing lasted 47 minutes. Ryder knew because he stood on the courthouse steps the entire time, smoking a cigarette he'd bummed from Hatchet. The second cigarette in 2 days after 2 years of not smoking, and watching the clock on the bank building across the street tick through the minutes with the slow, mechanical precision of a system that, for once, was working the way it was supposed to. When the doors opened, Reynolds came out first. Her face was professional, composed, but there was something around her eyes, a brightness, a heat, that told Ryder everything before she said a word. "Emergency custody granted. Janet Harlow is Ellie's legal guardian effective immediately. Wade Mercer's parental rights are suspended pending the state investigation." She paused, looked at Ryder with the expression of a woman who had spent 30 years inside the legal system and had just been reminded that sometimes the catalyst for justice comes from outside it. The judge reviewed the video footage. He reviewed the medical report, and he reviewed the phone records between Sutter and Purcell. He used the word unconscionable. He used it 3 times. Ryder nodded. The cigarette was burning in his fingers, forgotten, the ash growing long and curling downward in the still morning air. "What about the kidnapping charge?" "Dropped. The county attorney reviewed the filing this morning, saw the supplemental evidence, and withdrew it. You're clear, Mr. Kane, completely." He should have felt relief. He knew that. The appropriate emotional response to learning that you are no longer facing felony charges is relief, a loosening of the chest, a release of tension, the feeling of a weight being lifted. But what Ryder felt was not relief. It was emptiness. The vast, echoing emptiness that follows the departure of a thing you've been carrying for so long that its weight had become part of your posture. Without it, he didn't know how to stand. Ellie came out of the courthouse holding Janet's hand. She was still wearing Saint's jacket. Her face was different, not transformed, not glowing, nothing as cinematic as that. Just different. The jaw was less clenched, the shoulders were a centimeter lower. The eyes, which had spent 2 days scanning every room for threats, were resting. Not vacant, not relaxed, but resting. The way a muscle rests after being flexed for 3 years. She saw Ryder on the steps, let go of Janet's hand, walk to him. They stood facing each other on the courthouse steps in the winter morning sunlight, and neither of them spoke for a long time. There was too much to say, and no language precise enough to say it. The English language has thousands of words for love and loss and gratitude and pain, and none of them were adequate for what existed between a 38-year-old outlaw biker with a dead sister and a 17-year-old girl with cigarette burns on her shoulder blade who had found each other in a diner at 2 a.m. and had, through some combination of stubbornness and courage and the refusal to accept that broken people don't deserve protection, become the most important person in each other's story. "I don't know how to thank you," Ellie said. "Don't," Ryder said. "You don't owe me anything. You never did." "I know, but I want to say it anyway." She paused, looked at his scar, looked at his eyes. "You told me you didn't save someone once, someone you loved." Ryder's throat closed. He nodded once. Barely. "You saved me. You know that, right? I need you to know that. Not just what you did, but that you specifically, the person you are, the person who sat down in that booth and asked me if I was safe. You saved me. And I don't know if that fixes anything for you. I don't know if anything fixes anything for anyone. But I needed to say it out loud in front of all these people so that you can't pretend you didn't hear it." She was crying. Not the silent, repressed tears of the motel room. Real tears. The kind that come with sound and breath and the full-body surrender of someone who has finally found a safe enough place to fall apart. Ryder looked at the sky, then at the ground, then at the girl in front of him. And something in his face broke, not collapsed, not crumbled, but broke the way ice breaks on a river in spring, a crack that runs from one side to the other, and beneath it, water that has been moving all along, dark and cold and alive, finally visible. "I heard it," he said. His voice was barely there, a whisper with gravel in it. "I heard it." She hugged him. He didn't initiate it. He didn't pull away. He stood there on the courthouse steps and let a 17-year-old girl put her arms around him. And after 3 seconds that felt like the distance between two versions of himself, the one who believed he was beyond saving and the one who was beginning to suspect that might not be true, he put his arms around her too. Carefully. Gently. The way a man holds something he's terrified of breaking but more terrified of letting go. Behind them, 15 bikers stood beside their motorcycles and watched. Nobody spoke. Hatchet wiped his eyes with the back of his hand and pretended he wasn't. Boone blew his nose into a bandana and didn't pretend anything. Deacon stood with his arms crossed and his jaw set and his eyes bright with something he would never, in 1,000 years, call tears. Ghost put his hand over his mouth and held it there, and the sound he was keeping behind his palm was the sound of a man watching his brother find the thing that had been taken from him 14 years ago. Not his sister, because she was gone and nothing could bring her back, but the belief that he was capable of standing between someone and the dark and making a difference. The belief that he was not, after all, powerless. They left the courthouse at 10:15 a.m. Janet Harlow loaded Ellie into a rental car parked on Broadway, and the two of them sat in the front seats for 10 minutes before starting the engine. Just sitting, talking, the words inaudible through the closed windows, but the body language unmistakable. An aunt leaning toward a niece leaning toward an aunt. Two people rebuilding a connection that a dead man walking, because that was what Wade Mercer was now, not literally, but legally, professionally, socially, had severed with calculated cruelty and maintained through lies. Before the car pulled away, Ellie rolled down the window, looked at Ryder, who was standing on the sidewalk with his hands in his jacket pockets and his collar turned up against the cold. "Friday," she said. "What about Friday?" "Aunt Janet says we'll be staying in Missoula until the investigation is done. Could be weeks, could be months." She paused. "Rosie's Diner is an hour and a half from here. I looked it up. I know how far it is. I'm just saying, if someone happened to be at Rosie's on a Friday night, drinking bad coffee, sitting at the counter, I might happen to be there too." Ryder looked at her, and for the first time in 2 days, for the first time in longer than that, if he was honest, longer than he could remember, he smiled. Not a big smile, not a movie smile, a small, cracked, imperfect thing that lived more in his eyes than his mouth and lasted maybe 3 seconds before the weight of who he was and what he'd been through pulled it back below the surface. But it was there. It existed. And Ellie saw it, and she smiled back, and the 2 smiles that passed between them on that sidewalk in Missoula were not the smiles of people who had been fixed. They were the smiles of people who had been found. "Friday," Ryder said. The car pulled away. He watched it go. The taillights turned the corner onto Higgins Avenue and disappeared, and the sidewalk was empty, and the morning was cold, and the world was exactly as broken and indifferent as it had been 48 hours ago. Nothing had changed except everything. Ghost walked up beside him, stood there. 2 men on a sidewalk in the cold. "You okay?" "No." "Good. Means you're paying attention." Ryder almost laughed. Almost. It came out as a breath through his nose. The ghost of a sound, the afterimage of humor in a man who had spent 2 days in a place where humor didn't live. "Let's go home," Ghost said. They mounted up. 15 engines turned over in the winter morning, the sound rolling down Broadway like thunder moving in reverse. Not arriving, but departing. Not threatening, but resolving. The deep mechanical growl of machines and men that had come to a place for a reason and were leaving because the reason was done. Pedestrians stopped. Cars yielded. A kid on the corner pointed and said something to his mother, and his mother said something back, and neither of them knew the story behind the leather and the chrome, and that was fine. The story didn't need an audience. It needed to be lived. And it had been. They rode back to Black Hollow in formation. The highway unspooled beneath them, and the mountains stood on either side like walls of a corridor leading somewhere that wasn't marked on any map, and the sun climbed higher and the frost melted and the road dried, and the world, for one brief hour, looked like a place where things could be okay. 3 weeks later, snow was falling on Black Hollow, Montana. Not the aggressive, horizontal snow of a storm, but the quiet, vertical kind. Fat flakes drifting straight down through windless air like the sky was letting go of something gently. The kind of snow that makes the world look like a photograph someone softened with their thumb. Rosie's Diner sat on Route 93 with its broken neon sign buzzing in the dusk, casting pink light across the parking lot where a row of motorcycles was parked in a line that had become, over the past 3 Fridays, a fixture. Donna had stopped being surprised by them. She'd started keeping a pot of the strong coffee going on Friday evenings, the stuff she usually only made for the morning truckers, because the bikers drank it like water and tipped like men who understood that a woman working the late shift at a roadside diner was doing a harder job than most people would ever appreciate. Inside, the diner was warm. The ceiling fan still turned too slowly. The jukebox still played songs that were old when the building was new. The linoleum was still cracked. Nothing had changed about the place, and everything had changed about what happened inside it. Ellie Mercer sat in the corner booths, the same booth, the same seat, the same view of the parking lot through the fogged window. But she wasn't hiding, she wasn't scanning headlights. She wasn't pulling her sleeves down over her wrists. She was eating a cheeseburger with one hand and doing homework with the other, a biology textbook open beside her plate. And she was wearing a sweater that fit her properly, and her hair was clean, and the bruises on her wrist had faded to the color of old parchment, still there if you knew where to look, but no longer the first thing you saw. 2 stools down from the center of the counter, Ryder Kane sat drinking black coffee. The mug was warm in his hands. The coffee was terrible. He drank it anyway. He looked different. Not dramatically. Ryder Kane was never going to look like a man who slept 8 hours a night and had a retirement plan. The scar was still there. The knuckles were still rough. The eyes were still the color of creek water in January. But something had shifted behind those eyes. A settling. A recalibration. The look of a man who was still carrying weight but had finally, after years of carrying it alone, allowed other hands to help. The Iron Saints filled the diner around them. Ghost at the counter with a newspaper he was pretending to read. Deacon by the door, arms crossed, watching the parking lot out of habit rather than necessity. Saint in the booth behind Ellie, reading a paperback, a different one than the motel. He went through them fast, and occasionally looking up to check on her the way a medic checks a patient who is healing but not yet healed. Coyote in the far corner with his laptop, always with the laptop, always finding something, always pulling at threads that the rest of the world had decided weren't worth tugging. Boone at the end of the counter, not asleep for once, talking to Donna about something that was making her laugh. Actually laugh, the kind that comes from the belly and surprises the person making it. Hatchet was feeding quarters into the jukebox. Drifter was outside, leaning against his bike, smoking in the snow, watching the highway with the quiet, patient attention of a man who found peace in distances. Nobody was talking about Wade Mercer. There was nothing left to say. The state investigation had widened in the 3 weeks since the hearing. Purcell had been found in a motel in Billings and was cooperating with investigators in exchange for considerations that Reynolds said would likely keep him out of prison but end any future in law enforcement or private security. Sutter had hired a lawyer and was not cooperating, which Reynolds said was a mistake he would eventually regret. And Wade Mercer was in state custody, denied bail, facing charges that had expanded from child abuse to include evidence tampering, obstruction of justice, and, as of last week, suspicion of vehicular homicide in connection with the death of Karen Mercer, based on a forensic re-examination of the vehicle that the original investigation had never bothered to perform. The re-examination had found that the brake lines had been cut, not worn, not degraded, cut, with a tool that left marks consistent with the wire cutters found in Wade Mercer's tool shed during the execution of a search warrant that Reynolds had obtained 48 hours after the hearing. Karen Mercer had not driven off a wet road. She had been murdered. And the man who murdered her had spent 3 years raising her daughter in the house where he'd planned it, sleeping in the bed they'd shared, sitting at the table where she'd told him she was leaving, and hitting the child she'd tried to take with her. Ellie knew. Reynolds had told her, with Janet present, in a room at the attorney's office that was designed for exactly this kind of conversation. Soft chairs, tissues, a window that looked out on trees instead of walls. Ellie had sat very still while the words were spoken, and when Reynolds finished, she had said one thing. I already knew. Not the specifics, not the brake lines, but the truth underneath the specifics. The truth that her mother hadn't just died, that her mother had been taken, that the man who tucked her in at night, on the nights he wasn't hurting her, was the same man who had made sure her mother never came home from the store. She had known, the way children always know, the way the body knows things the mind refuses to name. She had carried that knowing for 3 years, alone, in a house with a dead woman's ghost and a living man's hands, and the weight of it had bent her but not broken her. And now, sitting in a diner eating a cheeseburger and studying mitosis, she was slowly, carefully, one Friday at a time, learning what it felt like to set that weight down. Ryder watched her from the counter, not staring, just aware. The way you're aware of a sound that used to mean danger and now means something else. The sound of her turning a page. The sound of her asking Donna for more ketchup. The sound of her existing, in this diner, on this night, alive and safe, and doing something as ordinary and as miraculous as homework. He thought about Lily. He always would. That was the truth he had accepted. Not in the barn, not on the courthouse steps, but sometime in the 3 weeks after, in the quiet hours between midnight and dawn, when the house was dark and the nightmares came, and he lay in his bed and let them come instead of fighting them. Lily was not a wound that would heal. She was a wound that would scar, and the scar would be visible for the rest of his life. And some days it would ache, and some days it wouldn't, and neither of those things meant he was okay or not okay. It just meant he was alive. And being alive meant carrying things. And carrying things was not the same as being crushed by them, and it had taken him 14 years and one night in a diner and one girl with bruises on her wrist to learn the difference. Donna refilled his coffee without being asked. He nodded his thanks. She paused, coffee pot in hand, and looked at him with an expression that was neither pity nor admiration, but something in between. The look of a woman who had seen a lot of people sit at this counter over a lot of years and recognized, in this particular man on this particular night, something that hadn't been there before. She didn't name it. She didn't need to. She just refilled the coffee and moved on, because that's what people do in diners in small towns in Montana. They keep the coffee coming, and they let the silence do the talking. Outside, the snow kept falling. The neon sign kept buzzing. The Harleys in the parking lot collected a thin white layer that made them look softer than they were. Dangerous machines dressed in something gentle, the way the men who rode them were dangerous people dressed in something that, if you looked closely enough, if you sat in the right diner on the right Friday night and watched the way they moved around a 17-year-old girl like a perimeter made of loyalty, looked a lot like love. Ellie closed her textbook, looked up, caught Ryder's eye across the room. She didn't wave, didn't smile, just looked at him. And he looked back. And in that look, across a diner, across 30 feet of cracked linoleum, and the space between two lives that had intersected at the exact moment they needed to, was everything. The booth, the rain, the wrist, the question, the motel, the hospital, the barn, the road, the shotgun, the courthouse, the car pulling away, the Friday nights, the snow, everything. Ryder picked up his coffee, drank it, set it down. The mug was empty, but warm, like a life that had been drained of everything it once held and was now, slowly, being filled with something new. Not the same thing, never the same thing, but something. And something after 14 years of nothing was enough. The jukebox changed songs. Hatchet had picked something slow and old, a country ballad about a man driving through rain, which was either ironic or perfect or both. The music filled the diner with the kind of sound that doesn't demand attention but rewards it. And the bikers drank their coffee, and the snow fell outside, and the neon sign buzzed its broken name into the night. ROIEs. And somewhere, in a courthouse filing cabinet in Missoula, 47 photographs sat in a folder that would eventually be entered into evidence at a trial that would eventually result in a conviction that would eventually put Wade Mercer in a place where he could never touch anyone again. But that was the future, and the future, for the first time in a very long time, could wait. Because right now, in this moment, in this diner, a girl was doing her homework and a man was drinking his coffee, and 15 motorcycles were parked outside in the snow, and none of it was perfect, and all of it was real. And real, it turned out, was the only thing that had ever mattered. The engines would start again. The road would call. The Iron Saints would ride out of Black Hollow the way they always did. Loud, together, trailing exhaust and reputation, and the particular kind of myth that attaches to men who live outside the lines, but never outside their own code. And Ryder Kane would ride with them, his hands on the grips, his face in the wind, his sister's memory in his chest and a new scar over the old one. The scar of a night when he walked toward a shotgun and didn't die. The scar of a girl who said, "You saved me," on a courthouse step and meant it. The scar of a man who finally learned that redemption isn't a destination you arrive at, but a road you ride every day. In the cold, in the dark, with the people who chose to ride beside you. But that was later. Right now, the coffee was warm and the snow was falling and the diner was full and the girl was safe. And that was enough. That was everything. That was the whole story.